Yep.
We're back, baby!
It's time for another one of these. The last one took a pretty long time to do, so I wanted to take a bit of a break before I hopped into doing another one. And I figured what show would be better to take a look at in a complete rewatch through than Bob's Burgers. And with a movie recently announced, at least at the time of writing this script, this seems like the perfect time to go back through the series and review and rank each and every episode. So, similar to what I did when I ranked every episode of The Office, let's go over what exactly I'll be doing in this video. I'll be going through each and every episode and giving my thoughts on them and then ranking them from best to worst by season. And then at the end of the video, I'll rank all of them. And obviously this is all my opinion, I'm not taking a look at IMDb scores or anything like that. I'm also not going to be giving each episode an individual score because I don't really like the idea of scores like that, and I'm also not very good at them. I fully expect that I'd get to the point where I'd be giving videos 1 of 3 scores, a 1, a 5, or a 10, and that doesn't really get across what I want to say about each episode. And it could honestly take away from my final thoughts on each episode. I also won't be going into an incredible amount of detail for each episode, but there will be ones where I'll talk more about the plot than others. It'll be kind of dependent on the episode and what all is actually going on in it. There's just going to be episodes where I don't have a ton to say. And I mentioned this in the last video I did like this, I'm still trying to reach my personally set goal of 100,000 subscribers. So I'd be eternally grateful for everyone if they could go down and click subscribe if you aren't already. Thanks again, let's get into it. And we're off. This episode sets up the show very well, I think. Not only does it do an exceptional job giving us a good sense of who the main characters in the family are, it also introduces the recurring villain Hugo and sets up some of the Belcher parents' backstory as well. The episode revolves mainly around Hugo, the health inspector, investigating Bob's Burgers, the restaurant, not the show, after Louise told everyone in her class that the meat that her father serves is actually human meat, which it's definitely not. The family makes up, and the rumor that Louise spread actually ends up bringing in a lot of pretty morbid exotic eating customers who want to try the supposed human meat. It's a fun episode, and it sets the stage super well for everything that the show wants to ideally become. More character introductions to be had. This is the first time we see one of the main characters, Teddy. We're also introduced to Linda's parents, who are recurring characters in their own right. For a show like this, I think its side characters are really make or break for the show as a whole. And honestly, all of the characters who are introduced here are classics. But what I didn't really like about this episode is that it's kind of a cliche trope. For a show that kind of goes on to disregard tropes like this, it's kind of weird how quickly the show went for the generic in-laws bad idea. I think they make it work though, at least the best they can. Also, the weird zombie sex dream is, well, really weird. Not a bad episode. So this is the first episode of the show that I don't think really works. It's not that I dislike it, I think at this point the show is still kind of finding its voice. And while this episode does do a lot to really help flesh out some of the characters, I think the plot and jokes themselves could have been a lot stronger. But this episode really does a lot to help make Bob a more human and likable character. And as one of the main characters, it's episodes like this where, even if I think they fall a little flat, that make you fall in love with these characters. Also, as I said in the every episode of The Office video, I just don't really find poop jokes that funny. Tina has been a big part of a lot of the episodes so far, which, I mean, surely you'd imagine since she's a main character. But this is really the first episode where she's the main focus. Tina is, well, growing up. And Bob is having trouble accepting that fact. This leads to Tina taking a class to learn capoeira, a weird dance fighting style, mostly because she finds the teacher to be attractive. Bob tries to stop this but ends up pooping his pants. Man, they really went all in on poop jokes for these first couple of episodes. Bob ends up fighting the teacher again and gets the respect of Tina. One thing that the show really does well is showing how much the family loves each other and how much they would do for each other. This is another episode that I don't really like, but I do think it's better than Sacred Cow. This is the first time that we see this kooky, fun side from Linda. It really shows just how much the kids really inherited from her, at least personality-wise. And seeing Linda singing everything after spending a night at a dinner theater is something that resonates with me, as it's something I would probably do. So Linda decides to put on her own dinner theater, but they end up taking things too far as Mort uses actual human organs and it gets a little grotesque. The next night they do it again, and this time they get robbed, but everyone just thinks it's part of the show.
A robbery, now that's a twist.
This is not part of the show, people. This is a real robbery. Kids, get behind the counter.
Bob isn't super happy about that, but Linda's happy about the great reviews they're getting. I think it's nice to see how much Bob will really put up with to try and make Linda's dream a reality. But I think the episode itself is just alright at best. But I do love the bit with Bob trying to explain to the customers that they're really getting robbed.
No, I can't break a 5, lady. I was just robbed. Did you not just see that? You were standing right here, idiot.
Oh, you people commit.
Get out!
Oh, wow, this episode feels like a ginormous step up from all of the previous episodes. This episode to me feels like the first time that everything just kind of comes together into what we love about Bob's Burgers. Bob being an amazing father, check. The family being generally wholesome as a whole, check. Jimmy Pesto getting dunked on, check. Bob spends the bulk of the episode driving a cab at night in order to be able to afford the party that Tina wants. We see all the fun of Bob dealing with the late night dealings of the town. It's pretty hilarious, and Bob even ends up shaving off his iconic mustache in order to give to Jimmy Pesto, so he'll let his son, Jimmy Jr., come to the party. This is an iconic episode and the best one of the season by far. While it's hard to follow up the brilliance that was the previous episode, Bed and Breakfast does a fairly good job. As always, it's fun to see Linda kind of go off the rails. But this time we see Linda deciding to run a bed and breakfast out of their apartment. They end up with a couple of guests, and no one appreciates the lengths that Linda goes through and also tries to force her guests to go through. Eventually she locks everyone in their rooms, and we see this couple who's really into BDSM trying to break out with their, tools. It's pretty funny and a good episode. Art Crawl is another phenomenal episode that really helps set the stage for what the show eventually becomes. Yet another new side character is being introduced to the show, this time in the form of Linda's sister, Gail. Gail is an incredibly fun character who I think is used just the right amount. If she was in the show any more than she is, I think she would get very annoying very quickly. Anyways, Gail has painted a lot of animal butts and they're hung up at Bob's restaurant, and it's scaring away all of their guests. Bob ends up standing up for Gail after she gets some backlash for her art, and Linda ends up painting over the art secretly because she can't stand it. Another fantastic episode. I didn't remember the first season having this many episodes that I would consider as some of their best, but here we are. This episode, I think, falls into a weird place for me. I'm really still not even fully sure where I stand on it. Bob and Gene are beginning to bond while watching a spaghetti western, Banjo. This encourages Gene to stand up to his bully, and Louise gets incredibly jealous of the time that Bob isn't spending with her. On one hand, I do like that unlike many other shows and sitcoms, the family wants to spend time with one another. But on the other hand, I think the humor in this episode falls mostly flat.
Say the line, Bart!
A pretty mid-tier episode.
Yeah!
Oh no, the restaurant's lease might not be renewed. I mean, obviously that's not going to happen, especially when you look at the runtime for this video. So it kind of makes it hard for me to really get invested in the storyline. It's fun seeing the duality of Bob and Jimmy's feud opposed to the relationships and friendships of their kids. I mean, it's really obvious they'd all be friends, they're right across the street from one another. I'm not a big fan of this episode. This is the first episode that starts a trend that we'll see a bit more as the series goes on that I like to refer to as Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks. Why would you leave them home alone? I'm still workshopping that. Feel free to give me a different title in the comments. The restaurant is temporarily shut down after some mold is found, and the family stays over at Mort the Mortician's place right next door. Bob and Linda go out on a double date with Mort and another mortician that he's just meeting at Jimmy Pesto's, and the kids are left home alone at a crematorium. Of course, they go looking for bodies and they end up almost killing Bob after he throws a fit on the double date. It's really weird and I don't think it works super well, but Tina ends up being an alright wing woman and getting Mort and his lady friend some alone time amongst the bodies. Meh episode. So it's weird seeing Bob get blackout drunk and basically shooting his business in the foot. And I think most people watching the series, really want to see Bob and the family succeed. It's weird episodes like this that show us just why they don't. Bob tends to get in his own way a lot of the time. Even if he's blaming the family for something that they did, it can oftentimes be traced back to him. This episode has its funny parts like Gene realizing he's allergic to lobster and Bob looking at young photos of Gene and deciding that's just how he's always looked. It's an episode that just doesn't fully work for me. Here we are, the first season finale. And it doesn't really feel like much of a season finale, it kind of just feels like another episode. Which is absolutely fine. I like this episode and it feels like a good representation of both this season and what the show becomes. It's not the best in the series or even the season, but I think it works. It has Gene being Gene, Bob giving advice and then realizing how terrible that advice is and trying to fix it, and Tina also being Tina. I also love the joke about Gene winning a gold medal and Linda saying they should get it bronzed. It's a dumb throwaway joke that always makes me laugh. Maybe it's because I'd been watching a ton of more recent Bob's Burgers casually before doing this video, but I honestly kind of forgot how mature and raw the early seasons of the show were, at least in comparison to some of the more recent episodes. You're not gonna see jokes about eating people being the entire episode in later seasons. And that's fine as well, shows like this evolve and grow. The season starts kind of slow and picks up a lot of steam by the middle, but it ends up kind of falling off again. A very good start for a show that ultimately knows what it wants to be. So, I know this episode title is supposed to be a Goonies reference, but I can't help but read this as The Dundies, which is the season 2 premiere of The Office. And much like that episode, this one is fantastic. Having the kids go out and look for treasure while Bob and Linda plan on doing the horizontal monster mash works really well. Especially when Bob and Linda realize that the kids aren't there because they aren't being actively annoying. It feels kind of real. And on the other end of things, this episode feels like the first time that they really got the interactions between all of the kids and their friends right. It all feels believable and they all bounce off each other really well. A very good episode in a solid way to start the new season. This is another fun episode. A bank robbery and hostage situation breaks out across the street from Bob's Burgers, the restaurant. It's pretty funny seeing the bank robber get food from Jimmy Pesto's and being upset with it before ordering food from Bob, taking him hostage as well and ending up back at the restaurant. It's a fun episode that I think has a lot going for it, the best of the 2 episodes for the season so far. This episode is alright. The kids lie to get out of gym class by saying they're doing independent study, doing synchronized swimming. Something that Linda has a strange obsession with. Linda ends up trying to teach them but quits, and Bob fills in an attempt to keep the kids from failing and thus going to summer school. But Bob doesn't really know anything about synchronized swimming, and Linda comes back to save the day. This is an alright episode, not a ton to say about it. Bob's excitement about the soft serve ice cream machine is pretty funny, but it doesn't really pull this episode up or down. And again, I don't really like poop jokes that much. I absolutely love this episode and basically everything that happens in it. It introduces us to a new character who makes appearances here and there throughout the rest of the series, Daryl, voiced by Aziz Ansari. The episode is honestly firing on all cylinders. Gene is hilarious from the get-go.
That's the song I want to lose it to.
Jimmy Pesto is being terrible as always, and we see Bob's obsession with not being outdone by Jimmy as well. There's also Linda's gullibility. How quickly she believes that Bob and the kids are learning boating at night for whatever reason is hilarious. And Jimmy does end up getting embarrassed at the end of the episode. It's a fantastic episode all around. Best of the season, maybe best of the series so far. So if you'll remember from a few minutes ago, I placed Sacred Cow pretty low on the list for season 1. A big part of that was that I wasn't a big fan of Randy, the documentarian. And hey, he's back. Great. This time he's into food trucks, kind of a weird change in his character, but alright. This episode isn't fantastic. There aren't many jokes that really stick out to me. Very middle of the road episode, but probably the worst of the season so far. I don't like this episode. I've been able to find something I like in just about every other episode, but I really do struggle with this one. Linda shrugging off Bob and Gail kissing after Bob mistakes Gail for Linda while high on dentist drugs is nice, I guess. It's cool that she's super understanding about it and doesn't go the route you'd expect it to go, but like, she's too fine with it. She's happy that Gail has a thing for her husband now, which is really weird, but then Linda gets mad when she thinks they're doing more. It's kind of convoluted, and I don't think the episode really works. It's not super funny, the storyline is a mess, and I'm not a huge fan of Dr. Yap as a character so far. Super weak episode. This feels like one of the most generic sitcom plots that we've had so far. A food critic is set to show up at Bob's Burgers, but due to his and his family's nervousness and downright bizarreness, the critic leaves a bad review. Bob decides he wants to get the review changed and goes to the critic's house and ends up taking him hostage. Then Linda and the kids show up, as do some other restaurateurs who've gotten bad reviews, and a UPS guy. It's somewhere between kind of funny and kind of cringeworthy. Not really in a good way. It's an alright episode, but it doesn't have enough going for it individually to bring it up above mid-tier in my opinion. You may have noticed that I've talked about a lot of characters in this series so far, but one who hasn't been brought up yet is Tammy. This is finally when Tammy shows up. Tammy is generally a pretty terrible person, and that plays off Tina's personality incredibly well. This episode really gives Tina a chance to shine, and we get a better insight into her eccentricities and a little too much of an insight into her erotic friend fiction. I think this episode works incredibly well from beginning to end, and the fact that Jimmy Jr. doesn't seem to understand that the character in Tina's friend fiction named after him is supposed to be him is fantastic. A great episode, towards the top of the season for sure. So, while the previous episode was a little more subdued as it focused on Tina, this episode that focuses on Gene is a bit more on the hyperactive side, which I think makes sense. Bob is going to do a cooking segment on the local news, and Gene ruins the segment as Beef Squatch. The two then end up getting a regular segment. This eventually leads to the two of them fighting, but it's the original dynamic that made the segment so popular. This episode has its funny moments, but the tension between Bob and Gene drags it down a little bit, at least in my opinion. Also, Linda flashing the camera to save her family is absolutely hilarious, as is it when we see Hugo recording it. A mid-tier episode that's close to being great. Wow, I didn't realize how short this season was. I was actually starting to write about the next episode when I realized it was season 3. This season was a huge step up from the first. It feels like the show really found its identity here, and they were beginning to really nail down what worked and what didn't. But while some of the episodes were among the best of the series so far, some of the others fell incredibly flat in my opinion. There's a lot of jokes that I think just didn't really land, and the same can be said for a few of the plots. But we were introduced to some characters like Tammy who become a mainstay in the series. The season feels a lot less dark than the previous as well, something that we'll see continue on through the next seasons. Speaking of which, with this, the last 3 episodes have all focused on a different one of the Belcher children. And this is another very solid episode that I think rivals Bad Tina. Louise has her iconic ear stolen by Logan, a high school student. Louise spends the rest of the episode trying to get her hat back. It honestly kind of reminds me of the Scott Tenorman episode from South Park, but obviously it's nowhere near as dark as that. Louise does end up having a biker gang threaten Logan, which I guess feels vaguely Cartman-esque. It's another really good episode and a fantastic way to start the season. Earsy Rider is a very hard episode to follow, but Full Bar certainly gives it its best effort. This is the first Halloween episode, one of a few holidays that'll become a bit of a trend going forward. The kids' Halloween costumes are all fantastic, as is the premise of them going to the rich neighborhood to get full candy bars. This eventually devolves into them sort of fighting with some older kids. It's a pretty fun episode. But on the other end, I think that the plot revolving around Bob and Linda going to a party at Teddy's doesn't really find its footing. It's still a very good episode that I think could have been fantastic if the B plot just had a bit more going for it. I like this episode, but it kind of leads us to a bit of a weird problem with the show's continuity down the line. Bob gets a package of some of his old stuff from the restaurant his father used to own, even though we find out later that Big Bob does still own his diner. Unless he owned more than one, I guess. Bob realizes just how terrible his childhood was, always being forced to spend all of his time at his father's restaurant. So he fires his kids and wants them to go out and enjoy themselves. But this leaves the restaurant short-handed, so Bob ends up hiring the guy who took him hostage last season. It doesn't work out, and the kids accidentally end up delivering drugs. It's a fun episode, and it's really nice seeing that Bob really does want better for his kids than he had. He really is a great father. I think it works pretty well, but it's the weakest of the season so far, simply because the other episodes were just so good. This is something I haven't said yet. I don't like this episode. It doesn't really feel like a Bob's Burgers episode at all. A lot of the jokes really don't land for me, and the episode as a whole kind of feels off. Also, the puppet thing with Gene is kind of weird, right? It's never really brought up again after this episode, but it just feels weird. I don't know. My least favorite episode of the entire series so far. So, while we already talked about Halloween episodes becoming a staple, my favorite series of episodes are probably the Thanksgiving episodes. I fully empathize with Bob and his love of Thanksgiving because I'm 100% the same way. And this episode kicks that series off in spectacular fashion. Mr. Fishodor hires Bob and his family to pose as his cook and family so he can be seduced by an old flame who has a habit of home wrecking. Bob drinks too much absinthe and just wants to spend time with his family, and everyone else is trying to play their part as a loving wife and children. The plan kind of falls apart, but also ends up working. I really like this episode and Linda's song. The music in this show actually kicks.
Kill the turkey.
Please.
The deepening is very obviously supposed to be a Jaws reference, and I think it works pretty well for the most part. Seeing Teddy super serious about the mechanical shark is pretty funny, but it's also a little weird seeing him this scared of something.
You know the thing about a shark, he's got lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes.
I think the episode works fairly well for the most part. Seeing the restaurant get destroyed isn't super fun, but seeing the entire town come together and fail to stop the flailing mechanical shark several times is pretty funny. An above average episode that isn't the best of the season, but it's still really fun. Oh man, this episode is absolutely fantastic. From literally the first scene, this episode just continues to build and build this absolutely hilarious premise. Seeing Tina absolutely freeze up her first time behind the wheel and hitting the only other car in the parking lot, which just so happens to belong to Jimmy Pesto, is absolutely hilarious. Tina being unable to keep her lie together is incredibly true to character and makes the episode that much better. I also really like the turn from the insurance agent who reveals that he knew that they were lying and used the Belchers to pull off an insurance scam of his own. An absolutely fantastic episode and definitely the best of the season. Maybe one of the best of the series. Gene has gotten himself a girlfriend, Courtney. The problem being that Courtney is absolutely awful. And not just in the show, I absolutely hate her character. Which I guess is the point of her character. She's supposed to be a super annoying, unlikable character. And despite how much I really don't like her, a lot of the episodes that she's in are really good. Spoiler, she's in more episodes down the line. But while a lot of the episodes Courtney is in are great, this one is kind of middle of the road. I think the episode does a good job of pretty accurately portraying young relationships and the really weird awkwardness that comes along with it. Not the best of the season. Man, these episode titles are long enough to be Panic at the Disco song titles. And hey, longer seasons means more holiday-related episodes. So let's hop into this Christmas episode. This episode revolves around the Belcher family taking in a man who thinks he's a mannequin who's come to life, Chet, voiced by Zach Galifianakis. He'll come back later. Chet ends up doing Christmas displays in the restaurant window and bringing a lot of business in. It's a fun episode that's a little weird, but mostly in a good way. I think the episode works for the most part, but I don't think that's enough to put it at the top of the season. While we've had a lot of episodes focusing on individual Belcher kids, their relationships with each other, and their relationships with their parents, This is a big episode in that it focuses specifically on the relationship between Linda and Louise. Honestly, both plots in this episode focus on some bonding between parents and kids. While Louise and Linda are fighting and dealing with their strained relationship, Bob takes Tina and Jean, because Jean wants to tag along, to get Tina's legs waxed. Bob even ends up waxing his legs with Tina to help her get through it. Hot dang, these really are a couple of great parents. This is another really great episode. Also, we see the return of Logan, the boy who took Louise's hat earlier this season. This is a kid-centric episode, and I think it's the first episode of the season that features the kids with all of their classmates, something that'll become more of a staple later on. A nude beach opens up, Hugo quits his job to go, just be nude. Which sounds like it'll be great for Bob, but the new health inspector is worse for different reasons. Bob ends up going to the nude beach and competing against Hugo in a decathlon to get him to take his job back. Meanwhile, the kids find out where the nude beach is and set up a telescope with Daryl. Welcome back, Daryl. It's a pretty fun episode all around, but I think it's probably mid-tier. So I haven't had a whole lot of chances to talk about this yet, but Zeke is a precious, precious boy and deserves to be protected at all costs. This episode revolves around Tina searching for the mad pooper at school. Basically, someone's pooping around the school. Some kind of butler. It turns out it was Zeke, and that while he was originally doing it by accident, by the end, it was for Tina. I don't like poop jokes typically, but somehow, they really, really made it work this go-round. Everything in this episode is fantastic. Tiny Bob is a stroke of absolute genius and never fails to make me laugh. This is definitely the best episode of the season and possibly the series so far. Honestly, episodes revolving around Tina all seem to work incredibly well. Bob is a fantastic father, but routinely drops the ball at being a husband. Not because he doesn't care, just because he's not fantastic at remembering things. Or I guess that he puts the restaurant first too often. But Bob decides to make up for that, and he and the kids go out and look for the love machine thing that Bob and Linda used on their first date. They do end up finding it, but it turns out that that wasn't actually Bob and Linda's first date, it was Bob and someone else. Again, Bob's not a great husband sometimes. It's not fantastic, but it's probably average at best. The Belcher family is struggling. We've seen that a lot in the series, but this episode really confronts that for the first time. Linda decides that she needs to get another job and starts work at a grocery store. There's a really good song in here where Bob begins to realize that he not only misses Linda, but that he actually does need her around the restaurant. It's really nice seeing what Linda brings to the restaurant as a whole. Her ability to strategically bounce check is honestly kind of amazing, and has realistically kept the business afloat for years. It's also fun seeing that Linda doesn't function super well at a more normal job, where she has someone besides Bob to deal with. A good episode that's a little above average. So while I've talked extensively about my distaste for poop jokes, apparently toilet jokes are perfectly fine because I love this episode. The whole E.T. parody works really well, and Jean's love for a smart toilet is somehow not incredibly surprising and weirdly wholesome. This episode again brings in a bunch of the kids' friends, which I absolutely love. They're quickly becoming some of my favorite characters in the show, especially Zeke. I think the inversion of the E.T. storyline with an evil toilet hunter lurking in the woods works incredibly well. I also really like the B-plot of Bob in a dead man's suit for the entire episode, before the man's son takes the suit back and Bob ends up in his underwear. A fantastic episode all around. Another episode that I love, and both my fiance and my friends are very well aware of this fact because I sing the main song from this episode all the time. It's really becoming a problem. This is the episode that I usually think of when I think of Bob's Burgers. It has basically everything in it that I think makes a good episode. Gail and Mr. Fish Odor, check. Good music, double check. A strategic takedown of Thomas Edison, the liar, thief, and elephant murderer, check. It works on basically every single front. Now, despite me talking about how much I love this episode, just based on this rewatch, I don't think it's the best episode of the series, but it definitely is up there. I said like 5 episodes or so ago that it seems like Tina-centric episodes seem to just work incredibly well. And hot dang, this is another absolute banger of an episode. So after Jimmy Jr. kind of leads Tina on, Josh ends up asking Tina to a dance. Remember Josh? Yeah, we didn't really talk about him. He's in the B-plot of an earlier episode. I didn't talk about it because it's kind of a nothing subplot, but he's voiced by Ben Schwartz, so that's fun. I like seeing Jimmy Jr. actually being jealous for once, and this really does end in the most Tina way possible. After she says that she can't pick between the two of them, she offers to make it work between all three of them, and she ends up alone. It's a really fun episode all around, definitely one of the better episodes. This is yet another really great episode, and this is the first episode that takes place outside of the unnamed northeastern town that the Belchers live in. Yes, the town is in the northeast. I've gotten a lot of comments about it on other videos I've done. It's in the northeast. But this episode actually takes place in Florida and features the return of Linda's parents. Both the kids and their parents are facing their fears throughout the episode. Jean, Tina, and Louise are facing a snake, and Bob and Linda are facing a group of elderly swingers. It's a good episode that does a really good job of building up our main characters even more. And I love Jean refusing to go out and look for the snake and being the tech guy. It's hilarious. This episode feels like a step down, but not because it's not a good episode, it's just because it's following up some of the best episodes that the series has to offer, at least so far. In a bit of a cliche episode trope, the family is on a family game show and they keep winning and coming back. They eventually end up facing off against the Pestos. The Pestos, why does it feel weird to say that? Jimmy Pesto's family, and also Trev. It's a fun episode and definitely feels above average, but it's far from the top of the season, let alone the series. This episode gives us another weirdly specific trait for Bob. He has hemophilia, which means that Tina and Louise both carry that gene, and their kids down the line will likely have the disease. Fun. Bob cuts his finger and Linda takes him to the hospital. They decide to leave Tina in charge in another fun case of, Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks. Why would you leave them home alone? The kids end up starting a literal underground casino and Mr. Fischoeder shows up because he's just the right level of degenerate. He ends up winning around $5,000 from the Belchers and they need to win in order to not lose absolutely everything. Bob ends up beating him in rock, paper, scissors as Mr. Fischoeder doesn't think Bob can throw scissors because of the stitches. And Bob rips his stitches open in order to keep his family afloat. A pretty good episode overall. Tina is excited to go to a boy band concert, but Gail has to cancel. Tina and Louise, who is not excited about the concert at all, end up making their way to the concert on their own. While Louise is originally not excited, she immediately develops a crush. Her first crush. On Boo Boo, the leading boy of the four boys. Now, she doesn't handle it super well. They end up slipping onto the boys' bus, and Louise slaps the ever-loving heck out of Boo Boo. The B-plot revolves around Gene getting really into tablescaping. He goes to a competition and ends up getting 4th place. It's a really fun episode and all around really funny. Solid. This episode introduces us to yet another mainstay of a side character, regular-sized Rudy.
Regular-sized Rudy? Why do they call you that?
Just look at me.
Okay.
The episode mainly focuses around the father-daughter relationship of Bob and Louise. These two are probably the closest of the family, and it's nice to see episodes based around building and evolving this relationship further. This episode really kind of focuses in on showing us how similar Louise and Bob actually are. He immediately is able to find her when she sneaks away from the field trip, and she is immediately able to convince him to do some more exploring. It's nice. Meanwhile, Tina is showing a nerdy kid how to be cooler, and he's trying to do the same for her. And Gene and Zeke end up being paired together. They're both absolutely precious. A very good episode overall. Gene has signed up to play baseball, but sweet baby Gene has the natural athleticism of, well, a young Gene Belcher. It's not good. He causes his team to lose, so Linda wants to send him to a baseball camp, but they probably can't afford it. The camp is very obviously a scam, but Bob sells his new espresso machine to afford the camp. But Tina has become addicted to caffeine and basically forces Bob down to get his money back. It's an alright episode, I guess. Tino's espresso addiction and the lengths that she goes to get the machine back is pretty funny, but I don't think that in and of itself is enough to bring this episode above a hard mid-tiering. Oh man, this season absolutely kicks. As far as I can remember, this series doesn't go through a The Office Season 8 situation where the show takes a drastic drop in quality. But man, almost every episode that I think of right off the bat when I think of this series seems to come from this season. I'm not that far through the series yet, but I can already tell that a good bit of the top episodes are probably going to be from this season. An absolutely fantastic season of television, and it probably saved the show, especially considering that this was the first full season that the show ended up getting. On to the next. So this is another one of those episodes that kind of falls into a bit of a weird place for me. I enjoyed some parts of it was pretty funny, but it seemed like everything didn't fully come together for it, if that makes sense. There are a lot of jokes that work, but a good bit that don't. Maybe it's the lack of the usual background characters, I'm not really sure. Bob and Linda get lost in the woods while camping, an alright premise that feels mostly delivered on. An alright start to the season, but definitely nowhere near the top of the series. Honestly, this episode might be the poster child for middle-of-the-road episodes. This episode's actually like 4 years older than the game, so let's just nip that in the bud before I get going. This is yet another Halloween episode and features the return of Daryl. The kids are showing off their surprisingly well put together fort when Millie, Louise's new arch-enemy, shows up and keeps them trapped there while she goes trick-or-treating. I love basically everything about this episode. The kids' characters play off each other super well, and I love the addition of Millie. Her character is something I didn't know that I wanted, but makes perfect sense. A foil for Louise. Someone who's weirdly on her level and weirdly obsessed with her. The B-plot of Bob and Linda putting together a Halloween costume and going trick-or-treating with it is great as well.
Bob?
No.
Is that you?
No. What?
Bob, from the burger place.
Oh, no way. I'm not.
I recognize you anyway.
I'm not.
God, that is hilarious.
That's still not me.
That is hilarious.
It's not me.
A fantastic episode overall. This episode is kind of rare, in the fact that Linda is solely in the A-plot. Usually she's paired with Bob or a kid, but this time she's on her own. Or at least on her own with a handsome seaplane pilot. And Linda takes full advantage of her rare time in the spotlight. She's absolutely fantastic in this episode, from her first line about painting the town beige. Mr. Fishodor is also fun in this episode, just kind of showing up and throwing out one-liners.
Oh, you should teach at my school.
And you should work in my coal mine. Gotta go!
The only thing I wasn't a huge fan of in this episode is that it kind of feels low stakes for the vast majority of it. We know Linda isn't going to cheat on Bob, and seeing Bob get more and more nervous about it doesn't work super well. Still, it's a good episode. At first glance, a storyline about Bob going to fill in as a cook at a frat house sounds about as off the rail as an episode could get. But I guess in that regard, the episode actually works fairly well. Seeing Bob kind of regress back to what he probably would have been like back in college is fun. And much like the previous one, this is a bit of a different type of episode where Bob is, for the most part, on his own. No wife, no kids. Until a little later. This episode is kind of good despite its vaguely weird plot, which is a weird thing to say, I think, mid-tier. Yet another Thanksgiving episode, and much like the previous, this is another really good episode. It brings in some characters who weren't around for the previous Thanksgiving episode, like Gail. Gail's a fun addition to this, and she definitely makes sense being there. So someone keeps putting Bob's beloved turkeys into the toilet every night. That's the plot. It's simple but effective. It's a funny episode. I really liked Bob continually going to the grocery store, and the guy at the counter thinking Bob was hitting on him. It's also kind of refreshing that Bob was also pretty receptive to the idea, it wasn't played down or anything. The only thing I really don't like about this episode is the twist that it was Bob sleepwalking the whole time. It seemed like kind of the obvious way to go with it, but at least they explained it with the cat allergy pills. Another very good episode. This is another Linda-centric episode, which is a great thing that we're blessed with these longer seasons. It gives a lot more characters time to be built up. So Linda being in a band back in the day is something that just kind of makes sense for her character. Them being generally not great also makes sense. This also kind of breaks the trend of Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks, why would you leave them home alone? They actually get the kids a babysitter who the kids then bully into taking them to their mother's high school reunion. It's a fun episode, but it's nothing special in terms of the show at large. Although I absolutely love the song that Gail wrote, it's quintessential Gail. This episode itself is probably a bit above average, but it's nothing to write home about. Bob is filling in as a home ec teacher. This gives him a chance to interact with characters that he normally wouldn't have much screen time with. Basically, all of the kids' friends. And Bob and all of the kids' characters actually mesh really well together. This episode is fantastic. And most importantly, we get to see our sweet baby boy Zeke take a more central role than he normally does. It's actually fun how similar Bob and Zeke are when it comes to cooking, and it's really wholesome how Bob keeps encouraging Zeke despite Zeke being very vocal about teachers and other people kind of giving up on him. The episode as a whole works very well, is super funny, and is probably the best episode of the season so far. This is an episode premise that I can definitely relate to. Christmas decorations being put up the instant Halloween is over is something that I deal with. So when their second Christmas tree is dead by Christmas, Linda insists on taking the kids and getting a new one on Christmas Eve. After some classic Belcher misunderstandings, they end up being terrorized by a truck shaped like a candy cane. It's a pretty fun episode, and it's definitely a good twist on the usual genres by doing a horror-esque story on Christmas. Also, seeing Teddy basically shut down after being caught in one of the kids' traps to catch Santa is pretty hilarious. It's an above-average episode. Not the best, but certainly a fun time. Now, if you've been paying attention, while we've talked about the kids at school a good bit, the vast majority of them aren't Louise's age. She really doesn't seem to have any friends her own age. In this episode, Linda takes matters into her own hands and invites over a couple girls from Louise's class against her will for a surprise slumber party. I love that Jean is absolutely all about the fashion show, and Louise, one by one, getting all of the girls to leave aside from Jessica is equally great. It's a funny episode, and it's really nice seeing Louise actually connect with someone in her own grade. It's a pretty wholesome ending to an episode that's overall pretty good. This is a hard thing for me to actually say, so maybe prepare yourself, get a coffee, a snack, and take a seat. This is a Tina-centric episode that isn't good.
Don't gasp, Linda. Don't you gasp.
Shh. I know. We'll get through this. This episode isn't terribly funny. Bob being terrorized by a magician doesn't really work super well, and Tina going on a revenge warpath seems a bit out of character for her. I guess the part at the end where the magician reveals that he farted on the meats that Bob licked as revenge was funny. I don't know, not a great episode by any stretch of the imagination. I didn't realize how many episodes actually brought Randy back. Anyways, he's back to help the Belchers film a local Super Bowl commercial. Bob ends up basically cutting the rest of the family out of the commercial in order to feature a former professional football player. But Jimmy ends up finding out and basically copies Bob's idea and puts out essentially the same commercial. Jean ends up clogging the toilet at Jimmy Pesto's restaurant, and some of the customers head over to Bob's restaurant. Kind of a mid-tier episode. I really don't think that this episode is overly funny, and the plot is kind of weak at best. I do like seeing the commercial the family wanted to put together at the very end of the episode, but that's not really enough to pull this episode out of the middle of the pack. This is the first vignette episode that we see in the series. Basically just an episode made up of smaller stories, something we'll see a bit more of as the series continues. In this case, the kids have written these stories for a school project, and Mr. Frond is reading them to their parents. The stories are all very representative of which kid wrote them. It's a pretty fun episode, and I like the reveal at the end that Mr. Frond is kind of just upset that he's the villain in all of the kids' stories. He's just kind of curious why the kids don't really like him, but I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? While the episode itself is fun and has a solid amount of jokes, I don't think it's the best that the series has had to offer so far. An above average episode. Tina isn't invited to Tammy's bat mitzvah, but is forced to go after Bob's Burgers is hired to cater the event. Tina ends up basically becoming the center of attention for the whole thing after she takes over as party planner. This episode also gives us the rare pairing of Louise and Tammy. They actually play off each other really well, with Louise obviously not being afraid to call Tammy out on her crap. The episode itself is pretty funny, as are most episodes that revolve around Tina. But what I think really makes the episode shine are all these small character interactions littered throughout. Solid episode. Teddy truly is the purest person. When he finds out that Bob and Linda are having trouble finding a sitter for when they go to a burger convention, apparently that's a thing, Teddy volunteers to watch the kids for a few days while they're gone. It's interesting seeing Bob viewed as a successful, egotistical restaurateur when we know that in reality it's the complete opposite. But Bob's sarcasm and jokes not being read correctly online is something that makes complete sense. It's funny seeing Bob and Linda in this uncomfortable situation, and they handle it about as well as you'd expect. On the other end of things, Teddy really is doing his best to be viewed as the Belcher's kids' uncle. And him managing to bond with Jean and Louise and eventually standing up for Tina is really no small feat. He absolutely tried his best. This is a good episode. I love that all the other burger bloggers have super creative names and Bob is just Burger Bob. It's definitely above average, but still towards the middle of the pack. I really like this episode, and it kind of feels like a good change of pace. The Belchers are going onto a wine train and the kids end up stuck in the caboose with regular-sized Rudy. They spend the bulk of the episode planning and pulling off an elaborate chocolate heist, which they manage to do successfully. In the other plot, Bob ends up taking part in a wine taste-off, when he really doesn't know wine. Watching the guy he's going against try to figure out what wine they're tasting is pretty funny, and the way Linda gamed the whole thing by using the spitting bucket instead of regular wine is both genius and hilarious. It's nice that Bob and Linda know each other so well that they're able to do something like that. A good episode overall, one of the best of the season for sure. This episode is a strange one because it really turns one of the Belchers into the bad guy for the story. In this case, it's Linda. She's bumped her head and now she 100% believes she has psychic powers. Because, of course she does. The problem with that being that she's now starting to try and help the police force. It's basically just a psych parody, but Linda isn't nearly as good at observation and is starting to lead the police down the wrong route. But, coincidentally, Bob and the kids figure out who actually is doing the crimes. I don't know, it's honestly not my favorite. Honestly, it's kind of weak, probably a bit below average. Oh man, this is a really good episode. In fact, this is another one of those episodes that I first think of when I think of Bob's Burgers. It really touches on all of the individual aspects that make an episode of Bob's Burgers great. Off-the-wall weirdness? Check. The family being incredibly loving of one another? Check. A Tina-centric episode? Check. This is a fantastic episode that follows the family as they try to navigate what's very obviously a brony parallel to get back an Equestronaut doll that Tina was tricked out of that's both very expensive and very sentimental to her and the family. The episode really feels like it's firing on all cylinders and even has Bob get a tattoo, or at least part of one. And what's kind of cool is they do keep that pretty consistent in the future. Best episode of the season for sure. I don't know if they're pronouncing ambergris wrong or if Futurama has led me astray.
You're covered in precious ambergris.
Precious hamburgers?
But I'm saying ambergris. Deal with it. And pronunciation aside, I don't think this episode works super well. The kids find a huge chunk of ambergris on the beach and decide to try and sell it and split the profit. I mean, I guess Jean just wants to eat it, which is also really weird. They kind of end up fighting about it, and seeing the kids fight really isn't my favorite, but there aren't many stellar jokes that can help bring this episode up. We're also introduced to Mr. Fischoeder's brother Felix, who decides to completely redo Bob's bathroom. I don't know, there's not a lot to talk about with this episode. Not very good. It's been kind of whiplash the last few episodes. Great, bad, and now great again. So yes, this is another great one. And unlike a previous episode, I think this one handles Dr. Yap and the whole idea of dentistry as a whole much better. Louise is terrified of the dentist and now she has her first ever cavity. So she handles it as maturely as she knows how, She sneaks out of the dentist's office and runs away, ending up at Gail's. Bob and Linda figure this out and send Tina and Jean over as inside agents to get Gail to drive Louise crazy enough to return home and get her tooth fixed. This episode works really well and puts Gail's insanity on full display. It's really funny the whole way through and is probably one of the best of the season. This episode, I think, is very, very close to being great. But the only problem is that it has just a bit too many storylines actually going on. If they had focused in on some of what they had a bit more, I think it could have been a much stronger episode. Anyways, Jean becomes a cheerleader after Tina tries out. Linda is super excited about it. Louise takes advantage of the fact that Tina can't talk, and that's a whole subplot, and Mr. Ambrose, the librarian, is incredibly extra. The episode itself is pretty funny, but the whole episode feels just a bit too unfocused, even for a Bob's Burgers episode. Especially in comparison to the episode that was right before it that felt hyper-focused on its story. An alright episode that could have been more. So this episode is something that we haven't seen before, a two-parter. And they really do their best to make it feel like a big, epic series finale. But being a two-parter comes with its own set of problems that the usual episodes don't typically have to deal with. In this instance, this episode is mainly just a setup for the payoff in the next episode. And as a result, the episode ends up kind of being boring. And I don't want to judge this episode based off its payoffs in the next episode. So this one is towards the bottom of the list. So as opposed to the last one, this episode is almost entirely payoffs for the setups that the last episode spent the whole time preparing. For the bulk of the episode, Bob and Mr. Fischoeder are in legitimate danger. They're tied up under the pier and the tide is very slowly coming in. And despite their best efforts, Linda and the kids are having trouble figuring out where exactly Bob's being held. It's a really good episode that honestly feels a little out of place in Bob's Burgers because of the super high stakes. This series isn't one that typically sets out to handle stories like this, but I think it does so fairly well. It just took an entire episode to get to this point. But seeing Felix just kind of get off with almost murdering his brother and Bob is a little frustrating, and I guess it's probably supposed to be. Anyways, a fun episode, definitely above average. So while Season 4 was still very good, it's really hard to follow Season 3. But that doesn't mean the season isn't good, because it is. A lot of the most classic episodes come straight from the season, and the writers definitely aren't afraid to experiment with the show's format, even this far into the run. With double episodes and vignette episodes, it's nice to see the writers still willing to try new things to see if there's anything to be gained from these different formats. And we got some absolutely incredible episodes from that. But on the other end of things, this season has a couple of duds, as any season of any show with over 20 episodes would. But overall, I think the season is very, very strong, and that's a good sign that the show will continue on at the quality we've seen. This episode a lot of the time feels like it's firing on all cylinders, but there are some lulls in the plot where everything kind of feels like it comes to a screeching halt. Gene's 80s-themed musical doesn't get selected to be put on, so he decides to put on a secret underground one-man rendition of Die Hard the musical. For the most part, both musicals aren't, well, good. But after everything kind of blows up and the two musicals decide to merge together in 30 minutes, they somehow put together a much better musical. Which is kind of weird, right? Like the acting, singing, and music all got much better in 30 minutes, which I know is supposed to show that them coming together is the best thing, but it kind of sticks out to me. Maybe that's a nitpick. A good episode overall and a solid start to the season. This is this season's Halloween episode, and I'm happy they went a different route than the typical kids trick-or-treating episode. It was fun the first few times, but it's nice to see a change of pace instead of resting on tried and true plot lines. This episode has Tina believing that they've trapped the spirit of a boy in a box, and she, of course, falls in love with it. She carries it around, and Jeff, the ghost in the box, ends up becoming incredibly popular with the kids at Wagstaff. Popular enough that Tammy actually steals him away. Tina ends up tricking everyone at the end of the episode in a way that we usually don't see from her. It's actually kind of refreshing seeing Tina stand up for herself like this. Another pretty good episode. This is one of those rare Teddy-centric episodes. or at least it focuses on the relationship between Teddy and Bob. Teddy is Bob's best customer, but he's become a lot more than that over the years. You don't call a customer to turn off your oven when you're out buying a Christmas tree or have them babysit your kids on short notice for a few days. Teddy has become Bob's best friend, but Bob seems hesitant about actually calling Teddy that, and that's kind of the theme of this episode. Teddy's been told that his cholesterol is too high, probably because he eats at Bob's every day. Bob cuts him off and eventually begins working out with Teddy, realizing that they actually are best friends. It's an alright episode. I kind of feel like Teddy deserves better, honestly. For as much as he does for the family, they really take him for granted. Mid-tier. It's time for another Thanksgiving episode, and much like this season's Halloween episode, they're trying something a bit different this time around. And again, I think that's for the best. This episode has the family actually splitting up on Thanksgiving. Linda and the kids are heading down to the new running of the turkeys, and Bob is staying home and relaxing. Not even cooking for once. The birds end up being incredibly aggressive and a Dawn of the Dead type situation breaks out. It's a really fun episode that I think works really well. It's a nice spin on the traditional Thanksgiving episode that takes it in more of a horror survival direction. Solid episode, very good overall. We're over 70 episodes into this review, so we've had our fair share of Gene-centric episodes. But this feels different. This gives us a more down-to-earth, emotional story than we're used to seeing with Gene. The story revolves around Gene trying to make up for forgetting his father's special ingredient, black garlic, while he's competing in a burger competition. Gene messes up a lot, but is distraught when he finds out that the rest of the family thinks that he's a screw-up. Despite all of Gene's joking and his playful nature, hearing something like that really does take a toll on him. So, at the end of the episode, when Gene is trying to get the ingredient to Bob and he needs to run through what is basically a gauntlet of things seemingly designed to distract Gene, he does end up coming through in the end for Bob, who unfortunately fails to win the competition, losing to a celebrity chef voiced by Kumail Nanjiani. It's a fantastic episode that does more than basically 5 seasons to explore the character of Gene. Towards the top of the list for sure. We've seen a lot of Linda's family, specifically Gail, but we haven't seen much from Bob's side. We've heard in the past that Bob's father sold his restaurant, but now we're getting a whole episode inside of that restaurant that was sold. It's kind of a plot hole. The episode itself is pretty straightforward, which in and of itself is kind of a change of pace this season. They've done a lot of genre bending so far, and it's a breath of fresh air to get an episode this straightforward. But that doesn't mean the episode itself isn't strong. Big Bob is almost exactly how you'd expect him to be after hearing about how terrible Bob's childhood was. Bob and his father do end up facing off and getting a sense of normalcy between them for the first time in years. And seeing that Big Bob kept the first review that Bob's Burgers, the restaurant, got, and that he's actually proud of him is really nice. A good episode for sure. This episode is kind of a weird one. On the surface level, it looks like a teen episode, but dig a bit deeper, and this is kind of a Louise episode as well. The episode functions as a spy story, which includes Louise going undercover. Twice. Tina and Louise are trying to find out who the mole in Tina's Thunder Girls troupe is, and they are eventually successful. What I really like about this episode is the nice moment at the end where Louise admits that she really just wanted to hang out with Tina, and Tina gives her a friendship bracelet. In the B-plot, Linda goes blonde but thinks that it's making her dumb. It's meh. If not for the kind of boring B-plot, I think this episode could be ranked super high. But with that, I think it's just a bit above average. This is another one of those episodes that I think just screams middle of the road for the series. On the bright side of the episode, we're blessed with a lot of the series' best boy, Zeke, and he's trying to do something nice for his grandmother. But on the downside, we're met with a B-plot so forgettable that even after I watched this episode to write this, I had to go back and re-watch it because I forgot what had happened. It revolves around Bob, Linda, and the restaurant's regulars doing some drawing. This is the weird and rare Tina-centric episode Misfire, but of course, it's not bad by any means. But by this point, we've seen enough of the show to know that Zeke isn't lying about his grandmother. The show has beats that it's likely to hit in its episodes, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good structure, but this doesn't feel like it does anything beyond that. Mid-tier. Another episode that I think is just middle of the road, but at least this time when I say that, it's a pun. This episode features Tina actually facing off against Louise, which is something that we really don't see often. After building their own go-kart, Louise wins the right to drive it, but she's absolutely terrible at driving right off the bat. Tina, however, shows an aptitude that we don't usually see from her. Tina even ends up getting drafted to race in a much higher division than Louise is currently racing at. The two eventually face off and Tina pushes Louise to victory, choosing family over victory itself. It's nice. In the B-plot, Bob and Linda start selling some of Teddy's homebrewed beer secretly and have to hide it from Hugo. It's an alright episode. I enjoyed it more than the previous one at least. This is a fantastic episode and really shows off everything that makes Bob's Burgers great. Bob makes a deal to finally get his plot in the community garden so he can grow his own vegetables to use for the restaurant. The downside to this? Well, he's agreed to give Logan, Louise's high school-aged rival, a job. This goes about as well as you can expect, with a whole song being sung about the duality of what Bob and his family are dealing with. Bob is obviously enjoying the garden, while Linda and Louise are being driven insane by Logan. It's nice seeing how much the family is willing to deal with to make one of them happy, something I'm sure I said a bunch of times in this video already. But Bob does end up going overboard with his garden and disregarding his family's feelings and gets called out on it. A good episode overall. Daryl has come to Tina with a new plan to help Tina get Jimmy Jr. and him get Rosa, a girl he has a crush on. The two of them are going to pretend to date in order to up their social standings. Everything actually goes according to plan aside from one minor detail. Tina has fallen for Daryl. The episode itself works really well, and Tina and Daryl aren't a pair of characters that I thought would actually work as well as they do. They play off each other really well, and Tina does the right thing in the end when she helps Daryl and Rosa get together. I really like this episode. Bob's striptease in front of the window where everyone can see him is hilarious. A good episode. It's election season at Wagstaff. Tina is helping Jimmy Jr. while he's running for class president against Henry, someone who's routinely sort of there. But when Millie decides that she's running, Louise steps in to run Jimmy Jr.'s campaign, despite the fact that he was already winning and would probably have won. Louise runs the campaign into the ground, runs herself, and through a fun series of events, both Louise and Millie end up getting disqualified, which leaves Henry as the de facto winner. But at the very end, we find out that Henry orchestrated the entire thing. A solid twist. The B-plot revolving around Bob and Teddy getting competitive with a knife and hammer is pretty forgettable though. An average episode. This is another vignette episode, and this time the kids are telling stories to Gail so she features in all of the stories, which is a nice change of pace. I also like that they work Scott Bakula into each of the stories as well. It's the right kind of dumb humor. So the anthology episodes of Bob's Burgers, while they typically work pretty well, sit in a bit of a weird place for me. A big part of what makes Bob's Burgers so good comes from the characters and their relationships with one another. So when you take these characters and put them in a story vacuum, it feels kind of off. Not necessarily in a bad way, it just doesn't always feel like you're watching Bob's Burgers. So while I do really like this episode, and I think it's probably one of the better ones from the season, I'm really happy they don't do these kinds of episodes all the time. Bob has a new obsession, remote-controlled helicopters. But when his breaks for absolutely no reason, he decides to try and get his money back, but fails. He and Gene end up confronting an RC helicopter bully, and Gene shows a lot of growth and maturity this episode, which feels weird to say, but it's true.
Oh, thank God you finally said it.
What I like about this episode is that we don't usually see a lot of episodes with bonding between Gene and Bob. It's nice seeing the two of them really come together, and it's a refreshing change of pace seeing Gene be mature. The B-plot revolves around Tina figuring out how to fake a book report. It's pretty unremarkable. The episode itself is alright as a whole, mid-tier or so I'd say. Yes, another rousing round of Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks, why would you leave them home alone? And hey, while they're home alone with Louise's class's pet chinchilla, it escapes. The kids and Wayne, a kid in Louise's class, spend the night trying to track down the chinchilla, eventually even teaming up with Tammy. Meanwhile, Bob and Linda are out doing trivia night, but end up cheating and get caught and kicked out. When they arrive home, just after the kids do, Louise takes the chinchilla over to Wayne's house to make him feel better. It's a pretty good episode that shows off how caring Louise can actually be. It's easy to forget that despite her constantly putting up her outer shell, Louise can be super caring. especially when it comes to animals. The episode's story doesn't feel incredibly coherent, but I think it works for the most part. This is a fantastic episode all around. The kids and all of their friends have Saturday detention after a bracelet-related fight breaks out. But the kids and all of their friends are desperate to get out of detention because of a cotton candy festival. The kids and Mr. Frond end up doing a big fashion show with the winner getting out of detention. The kids eventually team up and end up facing off against Mr. Frond, and they win their freedom and run off towards the festival. In the B-plot, Bob and Linda try to tell a girl selling magazines that she's part of a scam, but it doesn't go super well. I love this episode. It works the entire time, and I really dig how great of a model Gene is. This is his scene, and he's all about it. Even the B-plot of this episode is funny, with Bob and Linda tricking Jimmy Pesto into buying twice the magazines that they guilt bought. Great episode from start to finish. We've seen a lot of Gene's musical talent throughout the seasons, but now we're seeing the next logical step. Gene, his sisters, and a couple of other kids start a band. But problems quickly arise when Gene comes to the realization that he doesn't really know a lot about music theory. When some of the other kids start talking about changing the song's key, he's absolutely at a loss. This eventually leads to Gene, Tina, and Louise being kicked out of the band and Gene renouncing music forever, until his sisters convince him to get back into it. They end up making up with the other kids in the band, attracting a pretty solid crowd outside of the restaurant and leading everyone away to Lenny's birthday party. I like this episode, not just because it brings back Daryl again, but because we see a lot more growth from Gene. Kind of. He sort of ends up in the same position, but I think his outlook towards music has changed at least a little. It's a good episode. Oh dang, this episode is absolutely fantastic and kind of comes out of nowhere. Not that the previous episodes weren't good, but this feels like a tremendous leap in quality. It's Linda's birthday, and as we've seen from past episodes, Bob, and by extension the kids, are all absolutely terrible at giving presents. So Linda goes off to the grocery store and everything kind of goes absolutely wrong for Linda. So in the A-plot we see Linda, who is stranded and trying to get back home, and in the B-plot we have Bob, the kids, and Teddy all searching for Linda and learning new things about her. It's a really sweet and fun episode. It doesn't just show how great of a mother Linda is, but how great and fun she is as a person. If we add on to that the fact that this episode is funny as well, you get a great episode. Definitely the best of the season so far. So, this is a step down from the previous episode. But I mean, almost any episode would be. This episode gives us a glimpse into Teddy's life as the Belchers take one of Teddy's jobs to go put away patio furniture at a rich person's beach house. Of course, they immediately go into this beach house while no one is there and make themselves at home. We knew it was going to happen, and it happened just as fast as we assumed it would. But then Teddy comes to the house. Then the home's owner comes home. But she's really nice to the Belchers and lets them stay after Bob hurts his back. Linda and Louise craft a theory that she murdered her husband and is kind of confirmed at the end of the episode. Helen, the murderer whose house they're in, is also a pretty fun character. And her and Teddy seem like they got along really well. I absolutely love this episode. It's a Bob and Louise centric episode where the two of them run into a Japanese actor who played Hawk in a film series that Bob and Louise love. When they find out that he's in town to reunite with his daughter, who starred in the films alongside him, they put together a secret film showing and convince his daughter to show up. But while live dubbing the video, Louise actually reveals her secret reason behind wanting to organize the whole thing. Louise was scared that her and Bob would develop a similar riff and grow apart. We see Louise as the mature grown-up one of the kids, even though she's the youngest. But this episode really makes you step back and see her as she really is. A child who's scared she's going to lose her father someday. It's actually really sweet and recontextualizes everything in this episode. It's fantastic. Episodes that focus on the family's relationships more one-on-one like this are probably some of my favorites. I've seen this episode compared to an episode from a different series several times, so I'll go ahead and say it. This is the Bob's Burgers equivalent to the Community paintball episodes. Okay, it's out in the open, let's just move past that. The episode features a full town water balloon fight to see who gets their rent halved. So we see the family facing off against all of the other business owners in town. Bob goes like full-on Rambo and ends up winning the whole thing before Mr. Fischoeder gets the entire town to turn on Bob, but everyone ends up standing with Bob against Mr. Fischoeder. This episode hits all the right marks of funny, action-packed, and wholesome. All the best parts of what makes Bob's Burgers a fantastic series are all featured very prominently in this season finale. This is one of the best ways they could have ended the season. This is another banger of a season. The vast majority of the episodes are right around the average mark, and some of them are probably among the best of the best for the entire series. There's only like 1 or 2 episodes in the season that I think aren't very good, which is probably a higher bar than most seasons that we've talked about or will talk about. It's probably one of the top seasons simply for that reason. I mean, 3 of the last 4 episodes are absolutely incredible examples of the heights the series can reach. But let's keep it moving and see if we can keep this trend going. This season starts off with a vignette episode, which is definitely a choice. I don't know if these episodes are typically regarded as the best of the best or anything. They might be, and feel free to tell me in the comments if they are, but I'm really confused as to why they'd go that route. But that aside, this episode is very alright. It's not bad, it's just not the best episode, let alone even being the best vignette episode. A few parts here and there made me laugh. Gene's story is probably my favorite of the 3. Like I said, it's not a bad episode, but it's not the strongest start to a season that we've seen. This is another middling episode. After she's called boring, Tina begins dating a boy who's been vandalizing a bunch of stuff. Things begin to escalate, and after the two tag some stuff together and awkwardly kiss, they, or I guess Jordan, decides to do their biggest job yet. They're going to spray paint the ghost they've been doing on the big ship that'll be unfurling the mainsail with the ghost on it at a parade. But Tina, of course, feels bad, so she, Gene, and Louise spend the night painting over the graffiti. In the B-plot, a bunch of porta potties are placed outside Bob's restaurant and they're bad for business until they end up bringing in a lot of business. That's really it. The episode isn't super interesting and it's honestly kind of flat. It's not bad, it's just sort of there. I think this is my favorite Halloween episode so far. It's fantastic. Louise is disappointed that she doesn't get scared at Halloween things like the rest of her family. So Bob and Linda reveal that they've been planning a special haunted house specifically to scare Louise. But when they get there, it's pretty disappointing. And suddenly, things start to get a bit creepy. There's some scary guy outside, the power goes out, there's weird sounds from the basement, and eventually they're chased through the house and onto the roof. But it turns out this was all part of the Belcher family's plans to scare Louise. I really like the twist in this episode, and it makes a lot more sense when you start to think about it. In another show, it would probably be considered funny or mean to set up such an elaborately terrifying haunted house for a 9-year-old, but knowing the family and Louise, it's an incredibly thoughtful gesture. A great episode all around. This is a very simple episode, which seems to be a trend with this season so far. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because much like their previous episode, I really like this one. It's Thanksgiving, and despite his love for Thanksgiving, Bob can't enjoy it. But Bob's car gets snowed in, so he decides to drag Gail through the snow back to his apartment. It eventually comes out that Gail's ankle is fine and she's lying, and Bob injures his back, so Gail drags him now. There's something that I noticed when watching this. There's kind of a continuity error, or at least the episodes are in the wrong order or were aired in the wrong order or something. In this episode, Gail mentions to the family that she's dating Mr. Frond, and the kids all seem fine with it. But in a few episodes, it's revealed to the kids that they're dating and they absolutely freak out. So that was weird. Anyways, I really like this episode. It's not as good as the previous, but it's still solid. The kids get into a spat with a mall Santa who tells the kids that he's going to tell the real Santa, and now the kids spend the episode trying to show the mall Santa that they're actually good kids and deserve presents. Unlike some of the previous Christmas episodes, this one is much more lighthearted, which is weird to say considering we're specifically talking about Christmas-themed episodes. But it's nice to be able to just sort of sit back for a bit and not have to worry about getting emotionally punched in the gut. I find it hilarious how the Belcher kids, when thinking of their good deeds, can't even think of anything in particular that isn't vaguely selfish. Like Tina helping a horseshoe crab that she probably kicked and killed. But the highlight of this episode, aside from the Fischoeder brothers, is Louise trying to basically throw herself on the sword to make sure her siblings get presents. It's a really nice gesture and a pretty average episode overall. Remember a few episodes back when I mentioned that the kids weren't shocked that their aunt was dating Mr. Frond? Well, in this episode they find out for the first time. As far as I know, but at least at the time I'm writing this episode, that's really the only time they slip up and do things out of order like that. I'll try to keep my eyes open. So Bob is having a friend that he made over for a dinner party, as well as Gail and Mr. Frond now on their second date. The kids spend the night trying to ruin the date because they don't want Mr. Frond as their uncle. There's something about the insanity that Gail brings into the Belchers' lives that's weirdly magical to watch. And I know I've said this before, I'm really appreciative that they don't overuse Gail. Showing up a few times a season is the perfect amount to keep her fun and not annoying. I think it's hilarious seeing Bob so desperate to try and impress his new friend and making a bigger fool of himself than usual, as is Teddy being super jealous of Bob's new friend. A fun and great episode. And we have Courtney, Gene's sometimes on-again, off-again lady friend, back in the leading role with Gene for an episode. This is kind of a rare side of Gene that we usually don't see. We've seen every other Belcher show interest in someone before, and aside from that weird puppet thing, this is the first time we've really seen that from Gene. Last time Courtney and Gene dated, he really wasn't into it, but this go around he actually falls for her. The episode itself is pretty fun, but I think that the B-plot revolving around Tina and Valentine's Day is probably the stronger of the two plots. And Bob going to the secret flower wholesale market is weirdly funny. It's an alright episode, middle of the road for sure. This episode brings back a character that we haven't seen in a long time, Gyro from the Season 1 episode Sexy Dance Fighting. And this time they actually do something good with his character. Bob hurts his shoulder and Gyro ends up helping him and eventually moving in with the Belchers after he's evicted. They use Gyro's character in a much better way this time around, as they take him out of the villain role and make him a good bit more sympathetic. And this time Bob is much more open to Gyro's teachings than he was several seasons ago. That's not just because Bob himself has changed, but because the show is fundamentally different than it was. It matured and figured out what it wanted to be and who the characters were. This is a great example of how far the show's come and is a great episode in its own right. This title is another reference to a Season 1 episode, but that's really all this episode has in common with that one. The family is looking to replace their old couch after Louise sabotaged the old one, but Linda is having a really rough time with this because she considers this couch part of the family. The episode kind of feels all over the place and like scenes are kind of cobbled together. I don't think it works really well, and despite a few funny parts littered throughout, I think it's a weaker episode for the most part. Tina is desperately trying to get yet another Thunder Girls badge. They really like going to that well for stories. Do we need someone to work kind of a random job? Just put Tina in there, say she wants a badge. Done. Anyways, she's working in the nurse's office when the nurse decides that she's found lice on Tammy's head and starts a lockdown. But things really get serious when she says she's going to shave everyone's head and burn their hats, including Louise's bunny ears. I mean, imagine the show if they got rid of that. Tina ends up standing up to her and no one, aside from Mr. Frond and the nurse, gets their head shaved. It's nice seeing Tina be the smart one who figures everything out. This is a really good episode that I think works really well. So I really like this episode. Regular-sized Rudy is having his birthday party at the park, but due to a miscommunication with the bounce house company, a bounce house has been delivered to another party at the park instead of Rudy's. So the kids go through another heist plot to steal the bounce castle. What's kind of weird about the story is they hint at a through line with Rudy, but it goes on the back burner for the vast majority of the episode. But that aside, it's honestly really nice seeing the friendship between Louise and regular-sized Rudy. Regular-sized Rudy seems like one of the few people who's able to bring out the sweeter side of Louise. She genuinely does care for him, and aside from her family, he's probably her best friend. I also find it hilarious that Bob is terrified of birds because he confused his life with a film when he was younger. Another really good episode. So while the last two episodes were really good, I think this episode is great. It has a lot of great things going for it. Gene is leading everyone on a quest to find the fabled two-butted goat. Zeke is super on board with this and seemingly temporarily replaces Jimmy Jr. with Gene for a bit. Louise doesn't think the goat is real and makes a bet with Gene where the loser of the bet has to clean the restaurant. After a lot of trials along the way, including Jean carrying everyone across poison ivy, it turns out that the two-butted goat is very much real. In the B-plot, the adults are getting super competitive around the restaurant, mostly throwing garbage around. That ends up paying off into the A-plot when the kids get back to the restaurant and see the huge mess that's been made. I love how the two plots are seemingly disconnected but manage to tie together in a non-contrived way. Bob and Linda don't happen to run into the kids while driving or anything like has happened several times in the past. This is quite possibly the best Jean story we've had so far, and probably one of the best episodes of the season. Dang, this is a pretty good tear of episodes. This episode brings back the biker gang that we talked about super briefly much earlier in the video, but this time Critter and Mudflap are trying to go straight-ish because of their relatively newborn baby, Sidecar. The problem being Critter has been arrested the day of a job interview, so he has Bob and the family go to sell his motorcycle. Linda ends up spending the day babysitting Sidecar, a very, very full-time job apparently, and Bob and the kids deal with the fun lifestyle of being vaguely associated with a motorcycle gang for a bit. It's a pretty fun episode that brings back and uses some minor characters fairly well. It's nice seeing the progression from Critter and Mudflap, but Sidecar kind of brings the entirety of the timeline into focus a little bit, which makes things a bit weird if you were to stop and think about it too much. Overall, another really good episode. Tina gets offered the soloist position after the other soloists of the Hormoniums, a group designed to sing to other kids about their growing bodies, gets mono. So when Tina is forced to sing in front of everyone about how much she hates kissing, it starts to ruin her social life. And with a party going on at Jocelyn's while her parents are out of the house for 45 minutes, that's not exactly what you want. Bob is fantastic in this episode. He steps in as a fantastic parent for Tina when she needs it, and his reverence for Marshmallow always makes me laugh.
All I know about Marshmallow is that she comes and goes as she pleases. She answers to no one, and she is truly free.
Okay, calm down.
It's a pretty good episode, but with all of the strong episodes we've seen so far, this is probably mid-tier. So, while I really, really like this episode, it kind of frustrates the hell out of me. Bob's close friend Warren comes to visit, voiced by Chris Parnell. You know, that guy who's in everything anymore. Warren is a highly successful businessman, and after he tries one of Bob's burgers, the actual burger, not the show, he decides he wants to invest and help Bob become more successful. So a lot of changes start to happen as Bob's Burgers, the restaurant, is slowly transformed into a tiki-themed place. But secretly, Bob hates this and eventually explodes at Warren. But here's the thing, Warren was right. Bob's restaurant starts seeing a boom in business as people find the place more fun and enticing. If Bob would have just talked to Warren before his blow-up, they probably could have figured something out. Warren isn't even fully tied to the tiki idea. He spits out like 4 other ideas at the end. I don't know, it's a pretty good episode despite my problems with that part of the story. This is not a very good episode. That was a fun streak of episodes, but it had to end sooner or later. So I'm going to need you to relax again. Get some more coffee, maybe decaf this time. Don't go overboard on the caffeine. Okay, ready? Boys for now have broken up. Or at least Boo Boo, the most popular of the boys, is going solo. It's truly a terrible day for all the girls around Wagstaff, but it comes out that Boo Boo is going to be performing at Wonder Wharf and is giving someone a chance to ride a roller coaster with him. So, of course, Louise wants to win. She ends up losing but saves Boo Boo from being thrown up on. The B-plot revolves around Bob and Linda finding out that a mob hit had taken place at their restaurant many years ago. It's pretty uninteresting, and that honestly brings the episode down a good bit. It's maybe the worst B-plot line that we've had so far. It is funny that Boo Boo does remember Louise from her slap, but that's really the only memorable part of the episode. Low tier. Tina's dream is finally coming true. Her family is sending her to a horse riding camp. After she shows how much she knows and how excited she is, the lady in charge gives her the most difficult horse to ride. So let's get into this. This woman is absolutely terrible. She's maybe the biggest villain we've seen in the series. Like, Tina was the only person who was excited about being at the camp, and she got sandbagged with a borderline impossible to ride horse. What is this woman's problem? This is how you absolutely ruin someone's interest in something. Anyways, the episode outside of this is mid-tier. I'd say it has its funny moments. Paul Rudd's Jericho absolutely kills it, but that's not enough to bring this episode above the middle of the pack. Something that we've seen a lot of in this series is Tina being in love with the idea of love, not even just for herself. She'll set anyone up anytime. So when she finds a letter from an old woman from an old flame, Tina takes the opportunity to not only write back herself, but to set up a date for them. There's a subplot with the old woman's son stealing money from her. It's not super interesting, but it is funny seeing Sergeant Bosco show up at his apartment and him freaking out. Bob, for most of the episode, ends up hanging out with other chefs late at night and is exhausted, so he takes the mature route and has Linda tell them all that he can't go out because he's dead. Very relatable. It's a fun episode. Holy buckets, this episode feels like it's on an entirely different level than the rest of the season. This episode is absolutely phenomenal. Bob gets glued to the toilet by accident and he has a magazine interview coming up, so they spend the bulk of the episode trying to get him unstuck. The song in this episode is maybe the best song in the series. It's certainly the most played on Spotify. It's a jam for sure. We see a lot of the side characters we met throughout the show's run, the jokes are all on point, and the ending is surprisingly nice. Even though he is seen with his pants down, the whole town kind of rallies, and Bob ends up getting a pretty nice review, all things considered. By far the best episode of the season. This isn't a bad season, but it's looking like this might be where a turn is starting. A lot of the episodes seem like they're falling more towards the middle of the list, and there's even a couple that are beginning to fall further down. I'm enjoying the vast majority of the episodes, and even an average episode of Bob's Burgers is better than the best episodes of a lesser series. I still can find something positive to say about each and every episode that we're seeing at this point, and I'm hoping that that continues on as we get to the back half of the series. This is not a super strong start to the season. I don't typically like trippier episodes like this. I think Burgerboss did it well where it was just one short sequence, but in this case it's the entire episode. The fever dream world I think would be fun for a bit, but it definitely overstays its welcome. The episode is mainly about Louise learning to forgive her family after they accidentally destroy her Coochie Copy. She confronts different versions of her family and learns lessons throughout, and her family tries to fix and eventually replace Coochie Copy. It's pretty funny seeing Louise get more and more annoyed with the singing happening in her fever dream, and I like the toy shop owner. That's probably all I can really think of that sticks out to me in this episode. Not the best way to kick things off. This episode focuses on Teddy, Teddy's ex-wife, and how Teddy's been handling the divorce more than we've ever seen. Teddy is very obviously still hung up on his ex-wife and has been fixing up a boat in order to show her just how good he's been doing. Which is definitely a super healthy way to handle this whole thing. Teddy finally deciding to let go of his ex-wife and burning his boat is a nice end to a surprisingly touching episode. And the jokes remain present throughout as well, with Gene even cutting in to ask if they should continue to tow the burning boat. Which, no, they shouldn't. It's an alright episode for the most part, definitely a step up from the previous episode. I've mentioned him a few times throughout the series so far, but I haven't really talked about Mr. Ambrose in detail yet. He works in the library at the school, he's voiced by Billy Eichner, and he's constantly pushing kids to do stupid things because of his overwhelming boredom. He's the one who convinced Louise to talk about how terrible Thomas Edison was, he's the one who caused all the drama when Gene was a cheerleader, and now he's getting Tina into witchcraft. Seeing Tina get way too into witchcraft and the confidence that comes along with it is hilarious. As is when she faces off against the crossing guard, who used to be in the same coven as Mr. Ambrose. It's a really fun episode that explores Tina's character in an interesting way. Of all the wells that Bob's Burgers could return to, the illegal meat racket is the one that I expected. But this time it's actual horse meat instead of the rumor of human meat. And they really only serve one burger to Teddy, who's mostly just there to taste test. Bob ends up forming an uneasy alliance with Hugo and Ron to take down the horse meat dealer, but he ends up being a pretty nice guy, aside from his love of ska. Here's your fun fact, ska actually came before reggae.
But you know that reggae came from ska. Did you know that?
Yeah, you just said that.
Oh.
You literally said...
That's all I've got!
The makeshift team tries and fails several times to get the horse meat vendor to admit to it before finally succeeding. It's an alright episode, it's fun for the most part. definitely mid-tier. We've seen a lot of pairings and character relationship explorations. I mean, we're over 100 episodes into the series, but surprisingly, we haven't really explored the dynamic between Jean and Louise. And if you like the incredibly fun game of Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks, why would you leave them home alone? You'll love this special edition without Tina. Because Tina has gotten detention, Bob and Linda are forced to leave Jean and Louise at home for a small amount of time while they get their taxes done. We see Jean mature a surprising amount in this episode as he helps Louise. It's super sweet. And the subplots of Bob and Linda getting high on edibles by accident and Tina in detention are both pretty funny and not incredibly distracting from the main story. A very good episode. Of all the fantastic Thanksgiving episodes we've seen so far, I think this one feels like it's in a completely different league. It's definitely my favorite of the bunch so far. Louise and Jean, mostly Louise, hatch a plan to get out of seeing the yearly Thanksgiving play by putting on their own musical based off of one of Tina's stories and getting the whole thing shut down. They plan on using actual turkey giblets and exploding them all over the crowd in a visceral mess. I love seeing Tina actually kind of stand up for herself and her family in front of everyone in what's very obviously a thinly veiled song about accepting herself and being proud of who she is. I love this song, and I love this episode. Best of the season for sure. This isn't the first time the series has done this, but immediately after the show's Thanksgiving episode, we get the season's Christmas episode. It's kind of weird that originally we were given this episode in November, but here we are. It doesn't matter much on a rewatch like this, but I found it interesting. Bob has been drafted into Mr. Fischoeder's annual Rich Person Gingerbread Houseboating contest. He's specifically there to lose, and Mr. Fischoeder offers him a month of free rent to do so. But after Mr. Fischoeder is mean, Bob tries to win the contest, and that leads to everyone shooting each other's gingerbread houses. Of course it does. But Bob still ends up winning a trip to the zoo for his kids to cuddle with a baby polar bear.
I changed my mind about having kids. I'm gonna have one and feed it to this bear because I love him so much!
It's a fun episode. The B-plot is pretty simple, just the Belchers and Teddy going caroling and thinking they're face to face with a murderer, but he's just a nice guy. This is another really solid episode. This is a perfectly acceptable episode of Bob's Burgers, like just right down the middle. Not great, not bad, just average. Tina twists her ankle and is forced to telecommute to school. Something I'm sure no one today has any experience with. While doing this, she finds that her and Jimmy Jr. have a much easier time communicating and connecting than they do when they're face to face. There's really not a ton to say about this episode, honestly. It's kind of forgettable as far as Bob's Burgers episodes go. Middle of the road for sure. I really like this episode. There's a lot going on, but I think that this episode does a great job, maybe the best that we've seen, of balancing this many separate plot lines. Let's start with the main plot line. Regular-sized Rudy is being taken advantage of for quiz answers by a girl he has a crush on. Louise confronts both her and Rudy and actually ends up kissing Rudy before slapping him. It's actually surprising seeing this from Louise and not Tina for once, and it's a nice change of pace. Though to be fair, Tina is also trying to get a kiss on the trampoline, but she has diarrhea and has to deal with that. Jean is bonding with a substitute cafeteria worker, and Bob is taking a hip-hop dance class to impress Linda. It ends up working out. All of the plotlines in this episode feel like they work really well, and they're all pretty strong in their own right. Sorry, Quirky Turkey, this is the best episode of the season for sure. I'm not the biggest fan of this episode, but I can definitely see why some people would be. Mr. Business is one of Gail's cats. We've seen him a few times, and now he might be on the brink of fame and fortune, which could give Gail, and as a result of her not constantly needing money, the Belchers a sense of financial security. Bob ends up helping Gail prepare Mr. Business for an audition to be a cat model for a cat treat brand. They end up turning the whole thing down when Mr. Business begins to become stressed out from the experience. In the B-plot, the kids and Linda begin eating cat treats. That's really it. I don't find this episode super funny, and it's sad once again seeing the Belchers on the cusp of something more before they turn it down again. Not necessarily bad, but below average. This is another episode that I'm kind of meh on. There are a few parts that I think are funny, but we'll get to those. The kids are putting on a mock trial, and a couple of adults who work at the school are roped in as plaintiff and defendant. Jean, as a Southern lawyer, is hilariously beautiful, and in the B-plot, we've seen something that I never even imagined was possible. Bob ends up teaming up with Jimmy Pesto. Senior, not junior, obviously. But aside from that, there really aren't a ton of things in this episode that stick out to me. The writing is pretty good, I guess, and it probably would need to be for a mock trial episode, but that's really about it. Very mid-tier. This series is quite possibly a bit too strange and off the wall for a jump the shark moment, but this honestly feels like it's a top contender for that title. Gene's favorite chocolate is changing recipes, and Gene ends up working with the company and reminding them all why they love chocolate. It feels kind of far-fetched even for a Bob's Burgers episode. Like, yes, they do constantly deal with several multimillionaires, but that feels more grounded than changing an entire chocolate company. I don't know. But once you get past that fact, the episode is fairly fun. I'd probably put it a little below average. This episode is weird. We haven't had a lot of episodes where both Tina and Linda are sharing the spotlight. And I think this episode shows us why. I think the characters could have a very interesting dynamic, but in this episode, Linda comes off, well, not fantastic. Linda is chaperoning a school trip for Tina, where Tina meets and befriends a girl from a different school who also doesn't really have friends. But Linda consistently keeps trying to force herself into the friendship and ends up actually getting banned from the hotel. Linda episodes can be hard to pull off, and I think this episode has some good ideas, but it just doesn't fully execute on them. I honestly like the B-plot more, where Teddy and the kids throw Bob a way too late bachelor party. Bob just kind of going along with everything is fun and feels about right. This episode is definitely ranked lower on my list. So, I'm gonna level with you. I didn't have the Belcher kids start a religion on my Bob's Burgers bingo card. But here we are. I think the episode itself works reasonably well. The Belchers convince the aquarium owner to declare themselves a religion in order to avoid taxes and stay open. It's the kind of plan that someone who was young would probably come up with and no sane adult should ever agree with. But the episode would be quite a bit more boring if that were the case. So when an IRS employee comes to visit and has an obvious crush on the aquarium owner, he's willing to buy into the religion 100%, even jumping into a jellyfish tank and getting stung a ton. It's a pretty fun episode for the most part. In the B-plot, Bob realizes he's terrible with customer service and tries to learn from Linda. It goes about as well as you'd expect. An alright episode, mid-tier for sure. I like this episode. Tina as a fantastic debater is something that is both surprising and fully expected. Also a pat on the back for me for avoiding the obvious joke. Go me! But what's unexpected is the relationship between Tina and Henry, a member of the debate team she's joined. And I think this is actually the first time a boy Tina's age has liked her and she's felt nothing in return. It's a pretty fun inversion on the usual Bob's Burgers tropes that we've come to know through the last 7.5 seasons. It's pretty funny seeing Tina put into the situation she's put so many. In the B-plot, we see the Belcher family, minus Tina, come together to make a stop-motion film starring a hunk of meat. Good old Meat Man. Seeing Bob cry because of his love for what they created is pretty funny too. It's fun, but nothing groundbreaking. It's a good episode for sure. This is the show's first Easter episode. Bob and Linda hide eggs around the house with a map noting where they hid the eggs for the kids. The kids can't get all their candy until they find all the eggs. The problem being there's one egg that they're not accounting for, and Bob and Linda got way too drunk when hiding them, so they aren't sure where the egg is. So when the egg begins to rot, it takes a while for them to find it, and when they do, a local raccoon is guarding it with its babies. The episode is hilarious and works super well. This far into the series, it's really fun seeing the Belchers celebrating different things than the established 3 or 4 that we typically see. And it's just the family together in this episode. There's really no outside forces, which in this case works really well and is one of the backbones of the show. As much as I've come to love many of the town's characters, it's still nice seeing simple, the family at home episodes. A very good episode. Bob and Linda are going away for the weekend to do a full LARP / bed and breakfast thing. The LARP, or live action roleplay, is based off a show that Linda's obsessed with that's a parody of Downton Abbey. Linda is excited and Bob isn't, but once they're there, things kind of swap. Mostly because while they're there, they're both randomly selected as the help. Which, can we talk about that for a second? What kind of business strategy is this? Like, you're designating half of your paying customers as doing all of the work around the manor, while the other half gets to eat, drink, and smoke cigars? How did this not go out of business as soon as online ratings tore it apart? That's insanity. Anyways, Bob is really into the bourbon and cigars, and Linda leads an uprising of the working class against the upper class. It's pretty on the nose with its messaging. The B-plot has Teddy watching the kids again, but he's hurt his back and the kids try to help him get that fixed. It's definitely the lesser of the two plots. The episode is pretty good overall. It's Bob's birthday, and Gene accompanies him to the planetarium to see a laser rock show. But almost immediately, Gene freaks out because of how mind-numbingly loud the whole thing is. Despite how much he'd love to stay, Bob does the responsible thing and takes Gene out of the planetarium. Bob slowly reintroduces Gene to the music in the car, and the two decide to sneak back in and finish the show. And Bob gives Gene makeshift earplugs, which he probably should have had to begin with. In the B-plot, the rest of the Belchers go to a doll store, find a doll that Louise likes and is going to be destroyed. They end up sneaking it out. It's kind of nice seeing Louise take interest in stuff like that. It's easy to forget that, at the end of the day, she's still a child. But the A-plot is probably the stronger of the two. The M. Night Shyamalan twist of the two Nicks being the same person is the funniest thing I've seen in a while. Another great episode. I've liked a lot of episodes in the season, and I probably used the word great once or twice at this point. But this episode feels truly great, especially in comparison to the rest of the season. Louise has gotten in trouble for standing up to a bully, and Linda doesn't want to discourage that behavior. So while Louise is in in-school suspension, Linda sneaks her out and takes her for ice cream. They end up hiding from Mr. Frond and sneaking Louise back into the school before she gets caught. It's nice seeing this side of Linda who wants her kids to do the right thing, and I also really like seeing Linda and Louise have moments like this where they really bond further. Also, Teddy filling in at the restaurant while they're busy and things going absolutely terrible is hilarious. A fantastic episode. This is this season's vignette episode. The kids are retelling their Mother Day plays to Linda, but they know their plays weren't good, so they decide to improvise a bit. The stories start off relatively grounded and go off the rails, as you'd expect, pretty quickly. The entire idea behind Tina's play makes me laugh every time I watch it. The mixture of Freaky Friday and Alien works better than it has any right to. I think that this episode works fairly well as far as vignette episodes go. It's fairly funny the whole way through with certain parts jumping out, but I never really found these episodes to be the best of the best. Mid-tier. So there's an annual parade going on, and with the weather being terrible, the Belchers are primed to enter a float to get 4th place and win some prize money. But then Jimmy Pesto enters the parade, so now it's an actual competition. And as we've seen many, many times in the series at this point, things just continually get worse and worse. The weather stays bad, Jimmy and Bob get into a fight, and the float eventually gets off course. But by the end of the episode, Bob learns his lesson, relaxes, and just enjoys himself and jams to some music. Everyone joins in the dancing, and Bob wins the prize money for the float. It's a really good episode and feels like it could have been a season finale. And it kind of was, with the next episode just being a bonus episode for the season. We've seen hints that Bob really wants to be an outdoorsman, and this episode not only brings that back, but capitalizes on it better than had previously been done. But with Bob being Bob, while he's shopping at an outdoor equipment shop that's going out of business, Bob lays down in a tent and falls asleep. And since the store is going out of business, no one is going to be coming into the store for several days. So Bob and the employee who's also locked in there decide to try and climb out through the skylight, which against all odds and to everyone's surprise, Bob manages to do successfully. In the B-plot, the rest of the Belchers are being forced to watch Gail's one-woman show, which is, interesting.
Day one of my life, where it all went wrong.
It's a pretty fun episode, but I do wish that the previous episode had been the season finale instead of this. The series is still going very strong at this point. A few of the episodes are still surprising me with how good they actually are. Not that I was expecting the show to get bad all of a sudden or anything, but when a show runs for as long as this show has, there's usually a point where many people say the show's kind of fallen off. And I've definitely seen people say that this is about the time where it happens, so I guess we'll see. One thing I did notice is that while Gene does still have his episodes, it seems like he's starting to be reserved more for random interrupting one-liners, which hopefully doesn't continue on or get worse because I really like Gene's character, and I'd hate to see that happen. Anyways, on to the next. So this is an interesting idea for an episode that I don't think really comes together. Which is sad because I do love the idea behind this one. This episode is composed entirely of fan animations that are stitched together for the episode. The problem being that the animation style changes so quickly and so often that it's incredibly distracting. Which is sad because the idea for the story feels like it could be classic Bob's Burgers. But it's just too hard to get into this episode with the animation changes. The story feels a bit slower than normal as well, and I have nothing to base this on, but I think it's probably to help the fan animations. Also, the character of Dalton is hilarious, and I'm hoping he comes back in future episodes. But overall, I don't think this episode works, definitely towards the bottom of the list. After Mr. Fran's therapy dolls are destroyed and a school water park trip is cancelled, Louise does the unthinkable and teams up with her arch nemesis, Millie, to solve the whole dang thing. But working with Millie comes with a hefty cost. Louise has to do several playdates with Millie each time she wants help. It turns out that it was actually Mr. Fran who destroyed the dolls to get out of spending all the money on the water park trip. But what's arguably more important is that Louise actually begins to enjoy her time with Millie. It's actually a little weird seeing the two get close, but I think it feels relatively natural in terms of story. The B-plot revolves around Teddy getting into the poster business. It's pretty funny, and I think the episode as a whole works for the most part. It's definitely better than the previous episode, and I'd say it's pretty good. It's Halloween, and there's supposedly a wolf on the loose running around town. So Linda does the very responsible thing of letting her kids go out trick-or-treating. But don't worry because she'll accompany them. But Linda ends up taking the kids searching for the wolf because she desperately wants to be viewed as a fun mom. Bob, however, is staying home and is high on pain pills. Again, Teddy's doing his best to take care of him, but things, of course, go awry. When Linda and the kids are looking for the wolf, they come across a missing alpaca, and Bob, high on pain pills and running from Teddy, actually does run into the wolf, but of course, because of the pain pills, no one believes him. I think it's a fun episode that works pretty well. Tina has started her own babysitting business and Tammy has started one in direct competition. So when Tina is hired by a family to babysit, she's shocked to find that Tammy has also been hired by the family and that they're co-babysitting. Which is a really weird thing to do, right? Like, that's not just me thinking that's weird. Tammy ends up inviting over Zeke and Jamie Jr. to try and make it look like Tina did that, which is definitely a plan. They find out that the kid they're babysitting is a bully in school, and eventually Tina convinces her to stop being a bully. The rest of the family goes out to a restaurant and is scared because Bob always asks their opinion on the burgers at the restaurant, and then gets super self-conscious about it. It's a pretty fun episode for the most part, and seeing the family tiptoe around Bob in the restaurant is funny. Definitely above average. It's time once again for our seasonal Thanksgiving episode. This time, the Belchers are helping Teddy, who is absolutely hopeless when it comes to cooking. And while helping Teddy get things set up, they come to the realization that Teddy has some hoarding tendencies. So after Bob decides that he didn't do his new way of cooking the turkey justice, the Belchers end up back at Teddy's, basically setting his Thanksgiving up. It's pretty low stakes throughout, and I think that works for it. I mean, Teddy's family doesn't even make it in on Thanksgiving. But that doesn't mean it's not a good episode. It definitely is. I love the lengths that the Belchers will go to help Teddy. He's definitely part of the family by this point. A funny and wholesome episode. So I'm splitting these episodes up because I want to and I can, and I talked about the season 4 two-parter as separate entities. So deal with it. Linda has a dream that they threw an incredible Christmas party and decides that's what she needs to do. She and Bob do throw a party, but it's only okay. Mr. Present doesn't even show up, and her tiny Christmas tree, which is just the top of their other Christmas tree, and her favorite ornaments are stolen. So something that is different with this episode, aside from being a two-parter, is that while many of the episodes have songs, this one could realistically be considered a musical. There's a lot of singing, and the Bleakening song the kids sing is pretty great. I'm kind of torn on this episode, honestly. It's kind of in the same position as the other first episode of a two-parter. It's a lot of setup, and while there are funny parts, I think that it doesn't work really well on its own. It's kind of on the weaker side in my opinion. I'm also torn on this episode, but I do think it's better than part 1, for the same reasons that part 2 of the season 4 finale is better. It's just almost entirely payoff for the previous episode. The kids are out searching for the Bleakening, a creature who they believe stole their mother's tree and will steal their presents. When Bob and Linda catch up to them, they end up looking through a series of tunnels that ultimately leads to a literal underground club, where they find out that it was actually Art the artist who stole their tree, and a bunch of decorations from around town. This episode, I think, is much funnier than the previous. Marshmallows is both sad and hilarious. And the music is, once again, good. Still not great, but better than the previous. This episode just kind of proves what we've already known about Jimmy Jr. He's garbage and Tina is way too good for him. Linda and Louise take Tina out for a girls' night to lift her spirits. I really like the character of Nat, the limo driver. She's really down for whatever the Lady Belchers want to get into and is ready to throw down at any point. I hope her character comes back a good bit more in the future. Plus, they get revenge on Jimmy Jr. and he absolutely deserves it, so that's good. The subplot of Bob and Jean doing a trapeze class together and getting stuck because they're both too scared to let go is definitely funny, but is certainly the weaker of the two plot lines going on. Overall, I think it's a good episode. This is sad because I really want to like this episode more than I do. I don't think it's bad, but I really wanted it to be great because it has a fun energy about it. But upon this rewatch, I was actually kind of let down by it. And again, I don't think this episode is bad by any stretch of the imagination. I love all the kids getting really into Gaga Ball, which is apparently a real thing. It feels like something that I could see kids getting super invested in before they quit a few weeks later, which is almost exactly what happens. I do also like seeing Gene stand up for himself at the end of the episode. I wasn't blown away by the Linda subplot of her reading to kids at the library, so that kind of lands this episode in the lower half of the list for sure. In direct opposition to the previous one, this is an episode that I actually liked a lot more on the rewatch for whatever reason. I'm really not sure why either. Or I'm not sure why I had originally disliked this episode. It's really fun and a good mystery revolving around the school. The kids are searching for a hidden secret ceramics room that was hidden after it caught on fire. They're looking for it for the most Belcher reason possible to get out of a small, tiny amount of work. Originally, when I was watching this episode, and also when I was watching it this time, I thought there was going to be a massive reveal that the ballot stolen by Mr. Frond many years ago would be the reason behind the fire, and maybe that would have been a bit dark, but it felt like that's where they were going. Anyways, that plot is fun, and Teddy setting up shop in the restaurant and fixing phones is probably just okay. It's a good episode. This episode puts both Tammy and Tina front and center for the bulk of it. Tammy is accidentally left behind when her parents go onto a cruise over spring break, and now she has to stay with the Belchers. Tammy puts on a clinic on being an absolutely terrible person, and the Belchers are sick of her after about 15 minutes. But when a boy comes in and gets Tammy's number when he probably should have gotten Tina's, Tina spends all night talking to the boy on Tammy's phone. Tina and said boy have a very solid connection, so of course they do the typical person on a date with an earpiece being told what to say thing. I don't know, it's not great. Tammy is much better in smaller doses, or at least smaller doses than this, putting her character into a position where she's specifically supposed to be annoying and terrible for the entire episode, makes her annoying and terrible for the entire episode. And they don't really redeem her at the end super well, she just tells the boy to take Tina and go for a walk. Not my favorite episode. Apparently, Bob and Linda signed Louise up for soccer, completely forgot about it, and now it's the last game of the season. Louise doesn't want to play and is basically dragged there by Bob, who somehow becomes the coach despite knowing actually nothing about soccer. I mean, he fields a team without a goalie. While they're originally trying to lose the game by means of a mercy roll, Louise begins to feel bad when talking to her teammates that she's realistically let down the entire season, despite her not knowing she was signed up to play. So Louise ends up as goalie, actually gets a pretty good save off, and Louise's team gets their first goal of the season, before they get annihilated for the rest of the game. It's not fantastic, and I think it's weird that the coach wouldn't have called the Belchers at any point before the literal last game. Like, maybe just call at some point in case they forgot, which they did. Not the best episode. Gene has been invited to his first sleepover at his friend Alex's house, but Gene is super nervous about being away from home. And when he gets to Alex's house, he finds out that Alex doesn't want to be there either. And in fact, Alex decides that tonight's the night to run away from home, taking Gene with him. Jean eventually convinces Alex that running away and living in the woods surviving by eating sugar packets isn't the best way to live, and the two of them sneak back inside. The Bob and Linda subplot about them figuring out which one is snoring and it being both of them is pretty forgettable. Not a great episode. This is another episode I really like. First, we get another rousing round of Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks, why would you leave them home alone? And this time, they're hosting a secret zombie movie watch party. The movie is way too scary for all the kids, and Tina ends up saving the day by showing everyone a video of her when she was younger singing to one of her poops. I don't really like poop jokes, but at least this one was in service to the plot at large. In the main plot, Bob and Linda go on a double date that's not going super well, and the couples find themselves trapped in an escape room. Bob ends up having a fun time because of his love of riddles. It's a pretty fun episode that I think is pretty funny. The kids are off on a school trip in the woods camping for a few days, so Bob and Linda have the place to themselves. But unfortunately for the kids, the weather isn't exactly nice while they're there. So despite Tina really wanting to climb the mountain, they have to settle for hanging out with a hermit who's not actually a hermit. But said hermit accidentally inspires Tina to climb the mountain on her own, despite the weather. The rest of the kids save her and they all end up climbing the mountain. Bob and Linda keep trying to have fun at night, but end up falling asleep before they party way too hard one night. It's pretty funny, and I think this episode is a pretty good one. It's Bob's birthday, again, and this time Linda and the kids forgot about it. So they decide to put together a surprise birthday party for Bob with all of his friends. The only problem with that being that A, Bob doesn't like surprise birthday parties, and B, Bob doesn't really have many friends. But Linda persists for now and has Hugo take Bob with him out of the restaurant to get things set up. Bob gets to see what Hugo's job actually looks like and how he actually does provide a service when they stop at a restaurant that's very clearly not up to code. Bob even gets sick from what he eats there. Ultimately, the family just decides to not throw him a party and let Bob just kind of relax, which is nice. I think the episode isn't overly funny, but it works pretty well. A good episode for sure. This episode shows just what lengths Tina will go to be around some boys she finds cute, which to be fair is like 95% of boys. This time she's joining the junior lifeguards. But what I do think is something that's admirable is Tina's willingness to not only put herself out there, but to persevere through something even when she's not the best or even good at that something. She does get better by sheer force of will and determination, and that's a really admirable quality for someone to have. And while I think it's interesting seeing this from Tina, the episode itself isn't crazy funny or anything. And the subplot where Bob's Burgers gets Wi-Fi and has to deal with a cyber hacker is pretty forgetful. An alright episode. So do you remember earlier in this video when I talked about Tina going to a horse camp and the woman in charge actually being a terrible person? Yeah, the lady who's driving the truck in this episode is like 1,000,000 times worse. This woman legitimately almost kills Louise because she wants to drive down the alley. She's a full-grown woman, just talk with the kids, make a deal or something, or even talk to their parents. What you don't need to do is almost run over a child. How terrible this woman actually is kind of makes this episode hard to stomach, because there aren't enough jokes going on to offset the absolute awfulness. The Gale subplot isn't fantastic either. This isn't a great episode. It's Mother's Day and Linda wants everyone to do whatever she wants to do. And she really wants to go to some nice open houses to take advantage of the free food. But things get a little weird when they're shown a huge house. The owner's son knows they're not looking to really buy a house, and the home's owner, an elderly woman, is pretending to haunt the place in order to keep it from being sold. It sounds like there's a lot going on, but it's really less complicated than I made it sound. The episode is pretty fun and really puts all the different mothers in the episode in the spotlight in a pretty interesting way. An alright episode, probably a bit above average. The kids are all obsessed with something new again, and Tina accidentally tattles on Louise and she gets all of her cards confiscated. The family really goes in on Tina for going against family, but like, that happens literally all the time towards her. Jean and Louise have on multiple occasions used Tina or something that she's doing for their own personal gains, sometimes to her detriment, like the Quirky Turkey musical. Anyways, the kids spend the rest of the episode trying to Mission Impossible the cards back, and Tina manages to do so successfully. In the B-plot, Bob needs to give a eulogy for a man he used to buy pickles from, but they got into a fight a few years back. It's a little emotional, but it's not really the most memorable or anything. Another pretty bland episode. This episode has Bob, for the first time I can actively remember, questioning if he actually made the right choice opening his own restaurant. Bob's Burgers, the restaurant, has been hired to cater a wedding of a couple who had their first date at the restaurant a questionably short amount of time earlier. Bob ends up very desperately trying to make the wedding as perfect as he can in order to make himself feel better about his life choices. So in typical Bob's Burgers fashion, they end up destroying the wedding cake because of course they do. But Linda manages to salvage the wedding and everyone has a good time. I really like this episode. Seeing Bob kind of confront his life choices and come out the other side is honestly pretty moving. Also, the duet between Bob and Linda is a great song that I sing all the time. A really solid episode and a great way to end the season. So this season shows that the show is still going strong, but there's definitely a bit of a waiver here. The season I think has more episodes on the weaker side than any of the previous seasons did. It's still a good show, and there were several episodes that I think are some of the strongest we've got, but as a whole, it's a slight step back. And this is something kind of random that I noticed, but has Mort almost disappeared. He seemed way more prevalent in earlier episodes, but as the show's gone on, it feels like they realized that they got more stories and jokes out of Teddy, and Mort was kind of relegated to just being a background character and occasionally recurring bit character, which is sad and weird considering he's their neighbor, so he should theoretically be in more stories than Teddy. But either way, let's see if next season can pick up the slack. We've learned a few seasons back that Boys for Now have broken up. Now they're auditioning a bunch of possible new boys to try and replace Boo Boo, because 4 Boys is apparently objectively better. And with all these boys in town for the audition, Tina's usual boy crazy nature has gone into overdrive. And she spends literally the entire episode falling for boy after 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 boy. There's a lot of them. In the end, they just bring Boo Boo back. It's kind of anticlimactic. I don't really like this episode. I think Tina's storyline could have been stronger if there was someone there with her, but it just doesn't fully work for me. I'm not sure if this is just because this episode is immediately following the previous one, or if this episode is really, really good, but I really liked it. This is something I didn't even know I really wanted, a Bob's Burgers Ocean's 11 style episode. And this heist episode takes full advantage of the genre it's riffing off of. Mr. Fischoeder teams up with the kids to win the local dune buggy at their local arcade. But Mr. Fischoeder is actually a steak owner in Family Fun Time, and just wants to kind of reset the prize economy. But when Louise finds this out, she takes full advantage of everything she's learned, and wins the huge wheelie mammoth prize on the wharf. It's interesting seeing just how similar Louise and Mr. Fischoeder are, at least in terms of their scheming ability. A very good episode that's incredibly fun to watch. This is another very fun episode, but it brings up a slightly different gripe that I have with the series, and this might be a bit nitpicky again. So the Belchers are all different ages and thus in different grades. But in this episode, they're all taking the same class, and the class is entirely made up of all kids we know very well. And even if it's for a class you sign up for, most schools wouldn't put together kids from such vastly different grades and grade them in a similar way. It just seems a bit unrealistic, I guess, even for a show that's as off the walls as this. Anyways, the episode itself turns out to be pretty fun once you get past that fact. Seeing Tina try to navigate the world of business and turning out to be pretty good at it is both surprising and fun. But what this episode is trying to say is, well, very obvious. I'll let some of the cast say it for themselves in the form of a song they recorded for Adult Swim.
Let's rise up against the rich.
Burn their houses to the ground.
Let's rise up against the rich.
And put their heads on bikes in town.
Here's this season's Halloween episode, and this is a relatively fun one. While out trick-or-treating, several of the kids have their candy stolen by someone. So the kids end up chasing down the culprit, and it's revealed that it's Dr. Yap, the kid's dentist. He's just trying to keep the kids' teeth healthy. As far as reveals go, it's alright, I guess. The B-plot really feels like it drags this episode down, though. Teddy and Bob get into a handyman-esque competition with a handyman next door, and things kind of go overboard. It's pretty boring, to be honest. Not the best episode, probably a smidge above average. Of all the characters who I thought would be brought back to have their characters developed a bit more, Upskirt Kurt was probably the one I would have least expected. Anyways, he's back, and now he's in a story with the kids. He also kind of tries to get the kids to murder his rival pilot, who it turns out is his sister. The story does its best to try to hit some emotional beats with Kurt and his sister, but I think they, for the most part, fall flat. I think it's hard to bring back a character who was in the previous story just to be a generally terrible person, and try to humanize them a bit more, while also having him try to convince a bunch of children to murder his sister. The B-plot revolves around Bob and Linda getting really into paper airplanes. It's not fantastic, not a great episode. This is an episode that gives us an insight into Edith, the angry older woman who runs Reflections, the local arts and crafts store, with her husband. This episode, in direct comparison with its predecessor, does a much better job of making Edith a more sympathetic character. The biggest reason behind this being that this isn't Edith's second appearance. She's been there since the very first season. Yeah, she's been super irritable the entire time, but at least in this episode she isn't trying to get children to murder her sister. So she tricks Bob into driving her around on a quilt-related revenge quest. And it turns out that Edith is just upset that her piece of the quilt is being excluded because the senior citizen leader doesn't like it. But Edith's piece is deeply personal to her. It features the local freak show, the people who helped raise Edith and who are deeply important to her. So by this piece being snubbed, it's basically saying to her that these people didn't matter. It's actually very sweet seeing how much these people meant to Edith, and how far she's willing to go for their memory. But that aside, the episode is probably slightly on the weaker side. Edith works best as a character who shows up, says a few mean things to Bob, and then disappears. This is just too much of her, even if it's doing her character a service. This is one of the few episodes I can think of as of late that doesn't have two separate plot lines going on. It's just all the Belchers together trying to accomplish a common task. In this case, it's trying to save a turkey who's been pardoned, but is still going to be slaughtered. And they do manage to get the turkey to a farm where it's able to be safe and happy. But at the end of the day, I don't think this episode really does anything new. It mostly just feels like it rests on what we know about the characters and spoon feeds it to us. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination, but the jokes presented aren't enough to make up for the general lack of innovation in the episode. A lower tiered episode for sure, especially when compared to other Thanksgiving episodes. I'm kind of torn on this episode. Part of me really enjoys it and part of me doesn't. So Gene is asked to do a roller dancing thing by Courtney and her father. When he turns the offer down, his best friend Alex takes the offer and Gene gets jealous. Mostly just because he wants to hang out with his boy. Anyways, they kind of fight for a bit before all three of them roller dance together. Well, Courtney dances, Gene and Alex just kind of stand there. Then the three of them all go to play their weird math hopscotch wizard game in the restaurant's basement. It's a pretty nice episode about friendship, and it shows that Courtney herself isn't a bad character or anything. The B-plot revolves around Bob, Linda, and Teddy helping an agoraphobic woman make her way into the restaurant. It's not terribly funny, but it's kind of nice seeing a woman try to face her fears. I'll probably put this episode towards the middle of the pack. This is an episode that I don't think works particularly well. Tina is paired with a girl from her class to work on a science project. But Tina isn't exactly a model student. The two of them actually put together a pretty good idea for a science fair project where they plan to beam a signal into space to see if they can make contact with aliens. But obviously a show as grounded as this isn't going to bring aliens into the fold, so that drastically lowers the stakes of the episode. After another student messes with them by giving them a fake response, Tina starts a fight with her partner on if they should continue to reach out, and Tina quits the project the morning of. She then gives a speech in front of everyone about reaching out, and it's generally alright. The episode doesn't feel like the strongest in terms of story or comedy. I'd say it's a lower tiered episode for sure. A huge snowstorm has hit the town, and the kids have the day off from school and they plan to spend it sledding. The problem being that they're being bullied by Logan and some of his friends, with snowballs. Things escalate a bit, and a ton of girls from the various high school sports teams show up to pelt Logan and his friends with snowballs, and then Louise actually helps them get a bit of a head start. In the B-plot, Bob and Linda begin to knit scarves for the kids for Christmas. Yes, this is technically a Christmas episode, but Linda is terrible at knitting, especially compared to Bob, but the kids end up liking Linda's scarf better. There's not a ton to say about this episode. I think it's kind of on the boring side, below average. This is a rare episode that I don't really like. I think it misuses just about every character in one way or another. Linda is being slowly brought into the essential oil pyramid scheme, and the only people who really see this for what it is are the kids and, surprisingly, Gail. So the kids get Gail to try and talk Linda out of it, but Gail is quickly distracted by the scents, and the kids are put into a room with a puppy that Louise immediately falls in love with. In the B-plot, Bob and Teddy are helping an elderly neighbor move in a new bed and eventually give him some love advice since he has his first date in years coming up. Both plots are really underwhelming, aren't overly funny, and overall just kind of feel pretty meh. Low tier episode for sure. This episode brings back Helen, the woman who probably murdered her husband, and who seemingly had what may have been a crush on Teddy. This time she's looking for this little snail sculpture that her late husband, the one that she murdered, hid at an apartment building that he owned. She enlists the help of Teddy and subsequently the Belchers. But while Linda is still trying to hook Teddy up with Helen, Tina finds a single woman at the apartment who seems like she's probably a better match for Teddy, and she's also much nicer to Teddy than Helen. And Kathleen didn't murder her husband. He just died when he got hit by a train. Oh my god, did she murder her husband too? I usually like the episodes that revolve around Teddy, but this one kind of falls flat for me. Like, Tina and Linda both act like they need to do everything for Teddy when it comes to love. But he's an adult, he's a big boy, he can do it himself. Not to mention that Helen is significantly more concerned with saving the snail thing than Teddy. It's just mean. Another pretty low tier episode. Here is this season's vignette episode, and this might be my least favorite setup for one of these. Bob and Linda are fighting and the kids have broken Jean's bed and they're trying to distract their parents and get them in a better mood before they get home and realize that Jean's bed is broken. One thing that this episode does differently is that instead of telling completely different stories, they continuously build off the previous. Again, it's fun seeing each kid bring their own certain flair to the story, and it's pretty funny seeing how each story is based around trying to get their parents over their fight while also trying to downplay how bad a broken bed actually is. But also, why would Bob and Linda take the kids out to a romantic movie on Valentine's Day? They've left the kids home alone plenty by this point. So what's different aside from the writers wanting to tell this story? That's just a minor gripe though. It's an alright episode, probably a bit below par. I guess this episode gives us something of a change of pace. Instead of just being obsessed with boys and horses, now Tina is obsessed with a goose. A goose named Bruce. Tina begins dating a goose after she's not asked to the 8th grade dance by Jimmy Jr. Which, I mean, there's gotta be like a 50-50 chance of that happening at any point, right? I'm not entirely sure where the relationship sits at any given moment anymore. Some episodes, Jimmy Jr. definitely likes Tina, and others he wants nothing to do with her. I know it's supposed to be like an on-again, off-again middle school relationship, but this feels kind of excessive by this point. Anyways, Tina dating a goose is really weird. Even for this show, it feels kind of off. And I guess it kind of does something for Jimmy Jr. when it's revealed that he was just embarrassed that he hurt his butt while dancing at home. It's an episode that just feels off. It definitely hits the beats of a usual Bob's Burger episode, but it doesn't go beyond that. Lower tier. This is a huge breath of fresh air. Louise has been named principal of the school for a day, which realistically is supposed to mean that she has little to no actual power. But through the magic of bribery via a special bathroom in the principal's office, Louise ends up with some legitimate power somehow. Poop jokes aside, I think this episode works very well, especially when we see Louise put aside her chance to get all of the things that have been confiscated over the years to get Mr. Fron rehired. Somehow. Again, she really shouldn't have any actual power. The B-plot is as funny as the main one. Bob gets in his own head and is now unable to flip burgers properly, which for someone who owns a burger restaurant is kind of a big deal. He ends up getting over it by getting into Jimmy Pesto's underwear, which is less sexual than it sounds. It's a really good episode. Bob hasn't had a day off from the restaurant in way too long, despite him and the family seemingly closing the restaurant every other episode for some misadventure. So the family ends up locking Bob out of the restaurant for the day and he goes off on his own, trying to find something to do. He eventually winds up at a sandwich restaurant, and after the restaurant gets busy, Bob steps in to help work. Which is kind of weird when you stop to think about it for a few minutes. Like, he didn't know this person before this episode, and now he just steps in to help make sandwiches. But at the end of the day, Bob tells the shop owner that family and taking time off is important and closes the restaurant for her so she can go on a date. Which is equally weird. You just met this guy and he doesn't work there, but yeah, let him close the restaurant for you. Really weird. But what is surprisingly nice is when Bob returns to the restaurant and he sees his family and thinks they're waving to him. It's actually really touching for a minute before he realizes they're waving over an ambulance. I don't know how well this episode really works. It's not incredibly funny and the plot seems kind of contrived. Lower end of the list. Gene is feeling misunderstood and feels a connection with a blob of algae that lights up and reacts to sound at night but is ugly during the day. But one of the local yacht club owners has decided to have the algae bleached and killed because it looks ugly. So the kids spend the episode trying to keep the blob from being destroyed, which they mostly do. They get it away from the yacht club, but it ends up being eaten. It's the circle of life. One thing that I do kind of think is weird is when the kids say they're going to call the news and tell them, and the yacht club owner acts like it's too late. But I mean, I worked in local news for a bit, and they absolutely would have been all over that story. I don't know, there's not a lot to talk about with this episode. It's not the funniest, and that's kind of the only saving grace for the majority of Gene-centric episodes. They tend to be either super off the walls or emotional, but this episode doesn't really tick either of those boxes. Lower tier. I can see what this episode desperately wants to do, but I don't think it's very successful. It wants to comment about time and age crushing dreams and resigning to unhappiness out of complacency. But I don't think they do a good enough job exploring the older woman at the Marionette Theater's past to explain why she is the way that she is. It all comes down to just a few sentences while being fully confronted in the show's climax. It's a bit anticlimactic, which is kind of ironic. I guess it's nice to see Ron again, who hasn't shown up for a while, but for the most part, this episode doesn't really have much going for it. It's not funny, I'm not really invested in the story, and the B-plot, which revolves around a guy outside the restaurant handing out flyers, is pretty boring as well. Low tier. This is upsetting because I really want to like this episode because it features Nick Offerman, aka Ron Swanson, as a former radio DJ, now a washed-up bowling alley attendant. Bob, the kids, and Clem Clemens, the radio DJ, end up locking themselves in the radio station and taking over the airwaves. And then, once they're finally kicked out, they steal a radio van and broadcast that way. It's kind of weird they don't get arrested for this, but whatever. And the subplot about sweet potatoes feels incredibly tacked on and serves no purpose on the larger scale. Another low-tier episode. So I remember having to do the mile run as a kid, and I absolutely hated it. So in that sense, I absolutely empathize with Gene. And the plan to sneak off during the mile run to get ice cream is a pretty funny concept for the episode. And while I don't know if the entire episode itself comes together, there are certainly some funny parts littered throughout. Tina running with her hands at her side and Jimmy Jr. running, however exactly he's running, are both funny. But I really don't like the subplot of Bob and Teddy getting into a fight after Teddy's phone dies while trying to help Bob get tickets to see Cake 2. It feels incredibly aggressive and out of character for Bob. Maybe that's the joke, I guess, that it's out of character for Bob to be this invested and attached to a show. If it is, I don't think it works, and if it's not, it's just a weird out of character episode for him. Below average. This episode introduces us to Linda's version of Jimmy Pesto, Colleen, a woman who's in the PTA. But honestly, she's barely in the episode as Linda spends time with Joanne, the perfect PTA president. But things unravel in an honestly kind of boring way. Despite it being a Linda-centric episode, she's much more reactionary than usual, and I don't think that really works super well for her character. We've seen Linda in strange situations before, but she never really waited for anything to happen to her. She was always the one to be proactive. Like when she gets stranded and talks a bus driver into accidentally driving her the wrong way. I'm not a big fan of the subplot where Bob tries to get on a hardware store owner's good side after he accidentally makes a joke about a parrot that's recently flown away. Yeah, it's as uneventful as it sounds. A very forgettable episode. A constant that we've seen throughout the series is how much Tina wants to get rid of Zeke so she can have Jimmy Jr.'s undivided attention. And now with Zeke facing going to disciplinary school, Tina is forced to make the decision to either help Zeke and stay invisible to Jimmy Jr., or help Zeke and keep the status quo. One is selfish, and the other is the adult decision. And the sweet baby boy Zeke deserves the adult decision. The episode revolves around Tina wrestling with that decision as they break into the school and erase Zeke's art. Tina does come around and helps them get out without being caught by Mr. Frond. In the other plot, Randy shows back up and films a scene for a new movie in Bob's restaurant. It's definitely the more forgettable of the two plot lines. The episode is alright, probably close to the middle of the road, maybe a bit below that. I almost don't want to say this, but season 9 felt like a definitive step down from all of the previous seasons. I felt like the vast majority of these episodes were average at best. There were, of course, the standout one or two every so often, but even they weren't amongst the very top of the list. And I do want to reiterate that even the episodes of Bob's Burgers that I'm ranking lower are still good episodes of TV. The worst episode here is probably better than a lot of other shows. So when it sounds like I'm being negative, it's purely in comparison to Bob's Burgers. Anyway, let's hope the next season can pick it back up. This episode makes me borderline unreasonably mad at the kids. They've done a lot of thoughtless things throughout the series, but this honestly takes the cake. We know by this point in the series that Bob is terrible at buying Linda gifts for anything. But this time, Bob actually knocked it out of the park. You see, when Bob and Linda originally got married, Bob couldn't afford a ring. So he's finally saved up to get Linda a ring. It's super sweet. But when the kids find the ring in the usual gift hiding spot, it gets stuck on Gene's finger. And they then go to a water park where the ring falls off Gene's finger somewhere in the lazy river. So once they tell Bob and he bans the kids from his funeral, they call up Nat, the limo driver from a few seasons earlier, and head to the water park for a super futile search. Finding a ring at a water park could easily be a different way of saying finding a needle in a haystack. And the ending with the ring ending up right outside the Belchers' window, but knowing they'll never find it is a weird note to leave it on. This episode is one of the few times that I think the kids do something that I would classify as irredeemable. That aside, it's an alright episode, probably a smidge below average. This episode feels like it's basically a paint-by-numbers episode of Bob's Burgers. Like, this is probably about as down the middle as an episode could get. Bob and Gene go to the woods to find a super rare mushroom that just so happens to grow in the woods around where they live. They, of course, find the mushrooms but are accosted by a couple of other mushroom hunters, and the mushrooms end up getting run over. It's not super exciting and doesn't feel like it really covers any new ground in terms of characters, plot lines, or jokes. The B-plot centers around Tina getting new glasses that are actually the right prescription, and Louise tricking her into believing that she's gotten supervision from the glasses. Not a big fan of it, honestly. I'd put this episode towards the bottom of the list. For some reason, the episodes that always have the most scheming and backstabbing tend to be the Thunder Girls episodes. And this is not an exception. After Tina lets Bob help her build a cardboard boat, despite the fact that Bob is terrible with tape for some reason, Tina finds out that Troop 257, Tina's arch cookie rivals, are using a boat with a propeller. But they're only trying to win so their troop leader can get promoted so that they can get better cookie routes. It's all about the cookies, you fool! It's always been about the cookies. But the only person who believes Tina right away is Bob, which really shows just how great of a father Bob really is. For the most part, I think the episode is fine. It's not offensively mediocre or anything, it just doesn't really do anything to make it stick out from any of the other Bob's Burgers episodes. That's probably just because Bob's Burger definitely has its format down and likes to execute on it. Alright episode, towards the middle-ish. So, do you remember much earlier in this video when I was talking about how I usually dislike weird trippy dream sequences? Well, it turns out I hate trippy sleep deprivation pig ghosts even more, which is a sentence I would have never guessed I would have ever have written, but here we are and we're all better people for it now. After Tina has dissected a fetal pig at school, she now believes she's being haunted by it. Mostly because she kept having nightmares, is horribly sleep deprived because of that, and is now manifesting her visions outwards due to her exhaustion. And her exhaustion is really getting in the way of Tina's main goal this episode, to make out with Jimmy Jr. on the upcoming haunted hayride. In fact, she's so tired by that point that she even falls asleep like mid-makeout. It's kinda funny. As is how absolutely obsessed Linda is with Bob's huge ball of earwax in his ear, and she's also like weirdly sexual about it sometimes too. It's a pretty fun episode for the most part. I'd say it's probably middle of the pack, but this episode was nominated for an Emmy, so what do I know, I guess. Malls might be dying across this country, but that doesn't mean they are in the fictional world the Belchers are living in. So something I haven't brought up that I'm kind of curious about is how big is this town? There's kids there that don't know Tina, so is there a different school? And if the town is so big, why do we only see the same few kids? It just feels kind of weird, I guess. Anyways, the Belchers are at the mall and they're all having their own self-contained misadventures. Bob is shopping for pants, which somehow goes off the rails. Jean and Louise get those animal scooter things to ride around with, which somehow goes off the rails. Linda goes to a book reading, which somehow goes off the rails. And Tina pretends to be a sleeping boy's girlfriend, which goes about as well as you'd expect. It is pretty funny seeing Tina being unable to convince anyone that she's lying about dating the sleeping boy when she decides to tell the truth. But I think this episode just had a bit too much really going on to dedicate the time needed for any of the storylines, so it kind of suffers for that. An average episode. This episode brings back Hawk and Chick from much earlier in the series, and Louise gives us a new contender for worst things the kids or a kid has done in the Belcher family. But this time, in order to hold the film showing that she wants to, she forges a check for $1,000 that her family really doesn't have as a security deposit for the film. That adds a lot of stakes, especially when the actor who played Hawk steals the film and is going to cut part of it out due to embarrassment. Because many years ago, the actor had another actor cut out who he thought showed him up when it came to acting, and because of that, that man's career was destroyed. Overall, I think it's a pretty fun episode, and I'm ultimately happy that for once the universe didn't conspire against Bob and he was able to successfully return the film and avoid losing $1,000. I'd say it's the best episode of the season so far. This episode is perfectly fine, but it just feels like it's missing that extra it factor that makes an episode really great. Like, both storylines feel fine, they just feel like they could each use something a bit more. Bob and Linda are hanging out with a much cooler couple at a loft party, and they're obviously the least cool people there, and the kids are babysat by Jan, who is convinced to drive the kids around in her hot cousin's ice cream truck despite the roads being absolutely terrible. Man, they really might be better off just letting the kids home alone, which is a really, really low bar. Anyways, the kids end up stuck after the ice cream truck that doesn't have enough seats for everyone, let alone seat belts, spins out, and they decide it's too dangerous to drive. So Jen does the responsible thing. She takes the kids to an adult club where her hot cousin works, and Bob and Linda come to pick them up. It's a weird episode that's fine, nothing spectacular, just run-of-the-mill. It's Thanksgiving again, and once again the universe is conspiring against Bob to make sure he can't truly enjoy his Thanksgiving the whole way through. This time the gas has gone out, so Bob is unable to cook like he normally would. But Bob has gotten a super special and hard to get turkey that he's desperate to cook to the best of his ability. So Bob does the next logical thing. He cooks the turkey over a fire in the alley. Of course, the fire department shows up and tells him to stop, but he refuses. They show back up later and the whole turkey catches on fire before the fire department sprays it down. Despite him thinking the turkey has been ruined, it actually ends up cooked perfectly. It's pretty funny seeing how down to burn stuff Louise is, and the episode itself is alright. Not the best Thanksgiving episode, let alone being a contender for the entire series. This episode is looking to confront the more annoying side of Gene and his desire to be in the spotlight, while also looking at what lengths Linda will go to support her children, and to project her desires onto them. More simply, Gene auditions for a play but absolutely bombs the audition by being Gene. And Linda gets him the part by promising to work as a stagehand and to sell a ton of tickets to the show. It's interesting seeing Gene deal with rejection in the arts for maybe the first time, and it goes kind of rough, honestly. But weirdly, Gene does end up saving the show at the end of the episode. I'm not really sure how I feel about this one. It feels like they're kind of being aware that Gene can be annoying sometimes, but they're also sort of saying that that's what makes the show work, and I agree to a point. I'd probably put this episode lower on the list. It's Christmas again, and Linda has gotten a part-time job at the post office, but she discovers a package that didn't get shipped for Christmas and decides that it's her job now to get that present delivered. Gene and Louise go with her after they realize that Tina got them better gifts than they got her, and Bob and Tina are left home to try and keep the peace between Gail and her and Linda's parents. This episode feels strangely grounded for a Linda story. She's really just trying to get a package delivered, which she eventually does. And it's pretty funny seeing all the lies that Gail tells her parents to make them think she's incredibly successful. Bob even calls and pretends to be the bank, saying that she has too much money. It's hilarious. This is really just the right amount of Linda's parents. They're in the B-plot and can be insane with each other. It's a pretty good episode overall. Gene has been spending a lot of time at a pawn shop playing on a drum machine, and now he's been kicked out and banned. So Louise and Tina get the other kids and prepare to go down to the pawn shop to be annoying and convince the owner to let Gene back in. I absolutely love how immediately down Zeke is when he found out someone was mean to Jean.
Who was mean to Jean? What did they do to my precious little lamb?
But what Louise wasn't expecting was that Jean wanted to go and talk to the owner himself. He didn't want someone else to fight his battles for him. I think this episode shows a lot of maturity from Jean, which is always nice to see. It's also kind of refreshing that he didn't straight up win the music competition against the owner. The kids in Bob and Linda don't always need to win in order to grow, and I think this shows that very nicely. He's even allowed to come into the pawn shop once a month to jam. The Teddy subplot where he takes a job at Jimmy Pesto's and really wants Bob to be jealous is also really funny. This is a really good episode, best of the season so far. The 8th graders are being paired with the 4th graders for a Big Fish, Little Fish mentorship. Tina had a very positive experience with her Big Fish when she was younger, so she's desperate to be on the other side of things this time. But Tina keeps going further and further in her attempts to not just connect with, but give her Little Fish the same experience. After she's let down many times, she decides that she's got to dump chili on her by accident and help her get out of the room without anyone seeing. There's not a lot of stakes aside from that in this episode. Jean really isn't in the plot, and Louise and Tammy just kind of coast by for the bulk of the episode. Tina episodes are good, but she works best when paired with someone she can bounce off of. The Jim subplot is pretty forgettable. Low tier episode. I don't know if we've had an episode where Louise goes off with a couple of her own friends and not her siblings. In that vein, it's a refreshing change of pace seeing Louise hang out with kids around her own age. Or at least one kid her age and a 5th grader. And one of the kids is making her first appearance in like 6 seasons. Remember the slumber party episode where Louise makes friends with one of her classmates? Well, she's finally back, and now the 3 of them are hunting Wharfie, a sea monster at the wharf. The episode could have had the same problem as the UFO episode, but this episode really isn't about Wharfie. It's about the friendships and bonding that we see from the trio of girls. It's rare that Louise connects with people like this, and it's nice seeing her just having fun. Jean and Tina are just enjoying Spirit Week and showing up wearing more and more outlandish outfits that are all pretty fun or funny. And Bob is having a life-changing experience with an online chef. It's a very good episode. So there's a common rule on the internet that you never let something be named by a contest because things will get gross very quickly. Mr. Frond has apparently never heard of anything like that and is allowing the kids at the school to compose a new school song. There's Jimmy Jr.'s accidentally sexual song, Tammy just naming all of the kids at school, Jean and Louise just saying pee pee poo poo, and Tina who's legitimately trying to write a nice song for the school. But Tina, despite being a prolific erotic friend fiction author, isn't great at writing songs. And apparently this episode also just says that Tina isn't great at writing, which seems like it's against her character a bit. I'm not a big fan of this episode. The B-plot revolving around Jimmy Pesto's new awning is forgettable at best. Low tier. Gail is putting on a class to teach people how to properly art. And it's about as weird as you'd expect. So Linda and Tina decide to attend undercover to try and alleviate some of the weirdness. But against all odds, Gail actually inspires someone who's attending to be more passionate and forthcoming with their art. In the B-plot, Louise and Jean are looking for a stray cat, or rather, they're having people look for a cat for them. It's pretty boring. I don't really like this episode. It's not super funny, and it's hard to get invested into the story. I mean, if Gail fails, that's not really any different than what's usually going on with her, so the stakes are lower than they act like in the show. Very low tier. This is another episode where Bob sort of faces down the possibility of his restaurant failing. But instead of working through it while catering a wedding, this time he's digging through the rotting corpse of another restaurant that has failed and is auctioning everything off. While they're with the kids, they run into the restaurant's former owner, who's definitely not in a disguise, who's trying to steal, or take back, depending on how you want to view it, his father's flat-top grill. But he has basically no plan, as he proves again and again and again. Much like as Bob finds out how he ran his restaurant. He wasn't passionate about it and didn't know his father's recipes, which brings some relief to Bob. In the B-plot, Linda is obsessed with St. Patrick's Day and begins to dye everything, including the burgers, green. Which sounds like it would look disgusting, but she ends up bringing in a ton of customers. It's an alright episode. It doesn't feel like there's a ton happening, and the connection they try to make between the former owner and Bob feels pretty tenuous. Below average episode. This episode brings back a character that I was really hoping they would again, Nat the limo driver. This is now her third episode, and she's as fun here as she was the first 2 times. The Belchers are joining Nat for a road trip in her limo while she goes to return a snake to her ex-girlfriend's exotic animal farm. Bob is excited he doesn't have to drive for once. Gene once again has to deal with the fact that he's absolutely terrified of snakes, and Louise makes Tina get sick in order to stop at a weird roadside attraction. There's a lot going on, and despite the episode taking place in her limo, Nat still isn't really the main character of this story. But she does get some nice emotional growth in this episode, and at the end, Bob does end up driving the limo home, even though he was really happy to be able to relax on the way out. I really like this episode. How well Louise timed out her plan to stop at the attraction is hilarious, as is seeing Gene sprint away from the limo when he finds out there's a snake. I do feel bad for Bob in episodes like this where he gets the short end of the stick for absolutely no reason, but I think this is probably the best episode of the season so far. Ben Schwartz is back as Josh for the first time in a while, and that's probably the best thing I can think of with this episode. I don't really like either plotline going on in it, but the B-plot is probably the stronger of the two, and that's not usually a great sign for the episode as a whole. In the A-plot, Tina is at a tap dance show when Josh gets hurt when the platform he's supposed to step up moves. Tina suspects sabotage and goes through a whole thing of confronting a lot of people before they come to the realization that Josh just didn't lock down the platform. So that's something. In the B-plot, Gene and Louise make competing burgers of the day, but they're both absolutely disgusting abominations. You'd think that with his love of food, even if he didn't fully grasp the finer aspects of cooking, Gene would understand what makes food good. But I guess that's kind of a minor gripe. I don't know, neither plotline really grabs my attention that much. Low tier episode. Here is this season's vignette episode. The framing mechanism this time is that they're trying to make Teddy feel better, so all of the stories feature Teddy as a genius handyman who routinely saves the family in the fantastical situations they find themselves in. I think my favorite of the 3 is Louise's Waterworld story, probably just because of my irrational love for that movie. I've talked about these episodes and my feelings about them enough in the video that I'm sure anyone who's made it this far into the video is aware of my thoughts on them. I do like that they end the episode with Teddy's spirits being lifted. He absolutely deserves everything good that happens to him. Mid-tier. My stance on poop jokes is very clear, but this story for the most part isn't just a poop joke the whole way through. It's more about Bob and Louise confronting something about themselves. It's rare we see something about Louise that she isn't super comfortable with or is impacting her life as a whole. Louise is a home pooper, and she won the chance to feed sharks at an overnight aquarium stay. But when business doesn't happen all week, Louise isn't going to stay overnight at the aquarium. So Bob helps her confront her fears and she ends up feeding sharks. It's a nice story, and I like seeing Bob and Louise face this together. This episode definitely has a lot going for it, and I'd say it's one of the strongest of the seasons for sure. While learning about a project that she needs to do for school, Tina gets jealous of Tammy talking about her time in New York City. So Linda decides to show her how great their town is, and they end up hunting down a musician who is living in the town after giving up the musician lifestyle. Tina and Linda episodes are very hard to pull off because of their clashing personality types. Linda kind of ends up being obsessive and almost annoying, when the best Tina episodes are more laid back and slow. It creates a really weird atmosphere where both characters feel out of place. Anyways, Tina writes about the experience, and it turns out that Tammy didn't even really like New York. The B-plot revolves around Bob, Teddy, and the remaining kids at the restaurant calling into a sports show after Teddy got banned from calling in. Teddy really does have a deceptively busy and interesting life outside of the Belchers, but the episode itself doesn't really work. This might be the worst of the season. This episode feels like it's there to show how much Louise's character has grown throughout the series. I really can't imagine her doing what she does in this episode back in season 2. So she's on the cusp of real trouble, so she has to temporarily give up on pranking. But when a girl in Louise's grade wants Louise's help to get kicked out of school, Louise basically ends up pulling pranks through her, but when Louise finds out why she wants to leave school, Louise actually stops the prank and even helps her get into a friend group, which is why she wanted to be homeschooled. Because she didn't have any friends. It's really nice seeing Louise go out of her way to help someone who was in a bad situation, and to even stop them from making a terrible mistake. She's really grown a lot as a character, even if she is the exact same age that she was. The B-plot revolves around Jimmy Pesto being given his hernia medication by Bob because he doesn't really have anyone who can help. But Bob just kind of ends up bumming around Jimmy's apartment, and there's a nice scene at the end of Jimmy, Linda, and Bob all playing with cars. It's a good episode. This season felt not fantastic. Maybe that's just because I've been watching all of this series at once, and I've seen the highs this series can soar compared to the, not badness, but maybe blandness of some of the more recent episodes. I really want to reiterate that most of the episodes still aren't bad, but a lot of them feel safe. Earlier in the series, it felt like they were experimenting with the show's format, and that gave us a lot of great recurring episode types. Like the vignette episodes felt a little clunky at first, but now they're a staple. And there was a while where they were bending genres around different holidays that you wouldn't expect. I don't know, I might be wrong or viewing it through a warped lens or something. One more season to go, let's see what they do. This is yet another season premiere that goes in on the weird, trippier fever dream idea. And as I've stated earlier, I don't like these premises for entire episodes. This time, Bob's fallen asleep in his car and goes on an adventure with some of the garbage and random objects around his car to find a safe key that's somewhere in there. I'm not a huge fan of the A-plot, and the B-plot is kind of repetitive, which I guess is the point. Tina's learning a hand-slapping thing, and a bunch of characters all come in and do slightly different versions of it. I don't think it's incredibly strong as far as the episode premise goes, and it's not the funniest that I've seen. Lower tier. The family is getting ready to go to a symphony, which sounds like the absolute worst place you could take these kids. There's no way something like that wouldn't end with Jean on stage somehow. But before they leave the building, they come to the realization that Jean has contracted worms. Pinworms, to be exact. And throughout the entirety of the episode, he slowly infects everyone while they're trying to get ready. The episode itself is a bottle episode, so it's just the family in the apartment the entire time, and I think that works well for a premise like this. And it's not too hard to see what they're going for with this episode. It came out in 2020, and a pandemic is keeping the entire family inside. I think the episode works for the most part. The Lady and the Tramp thing between Jean and Linda is hilarious. An alright episode, much better than the previous. The fish owners are starting a nightclub, and Bob agrees to become the temporary chef. This episode really brings in like all of the favorite background characters. Mickey, Jen, and regular-sized Rudy are all in this episode. And that might actually be the first time they're all in the same episode. Anyways, Mr. Fish Odor is planning on gutting the whole thing after he gets bored, and the younger Fish Odor doesn't take it super well. In the B-plot, the kids make their own indoor pool out of a stock tank. It's an alright episode. I like that Bob actually does get his rent payment taken care of by Mr. Fish Odor for once, but I really have a hard time wrapping my mind around the fact that Bob's even remotely civil around the younger Fish Odor. Like, he tried to murder you a few seasons back and almost succeeded, but now they're apparently fine. It just always stuck out to me as weird. Mid-tier or so. Here's this season's Halloween episode, in case you couldn't tell from the title. This episode seems like it's going to be a revenge mission for Louise, but it quickly becomes about a woman who's trying to conjure her husband's spirit so she can get revenge on him for cheating on her and then dying. It's a little convoluted, to be honest. Especially when we slowly find out through the episode that he wasn't cheating and also died of a probable peanut allergy that he'd kind of happened to develop. It's kind of depressing, not just that the man died very young and suddenly, but that his wife spent 50 years absolutely hating his guts for something he didn't do. And I don't know if they wanted us to think about it like that, but I can't help think about how this woman spent basically her entire life hating someone for something that wasn't true. In the B-plot, Bob donates blood even though he might be hemophilic. It's not a fantastic episode. I feel like at this point there could be a whole subsection of episodes titled Tina Gets a Small Amount of Power, It Goes Completely to Her Head, and She Learns Her Lesson by the end. It's definitely happened a few times by this point, and it seems like it might be the new way to get around the Thunder Girl badge plot points. It's not bad by any stretch of the imagination though. The general plot structure, that is. This episode might be bad, I don't really like it too much. Tina gets super protective about who can put what into the time capsule she's in charge of, and Tammy starts her own time capsule, and that's a whole thing. There's a subplot with some Boys for Now tickets, but it's generally pretty forgettable. In the B-plot, Linda can't whistle. That's really all that happens. It's pretty unremarkable in terms of Bob's Burgers. Lower tier. So this episode, for the vast majority of it, seems like they're trying to give the worst things that the kids have ever done a run for its money. Because in this episode, they seemingly caught the restaurant on fire. I say seemingly because at the very end, they do a bait and switch with it. It's built up the entire episode that the kids' actions combine together in a perfect scenario for them to accidentally cause a fire, with each of them bringing either fuel, fire, or fanning the literal flames. We see all the kids one by one admitting what they did, apologizing, and feeling awful. But then Ron and Hugo show back up, they were in the episode earlier, and reveal that Hugo left out grease rags and they spontaneously combusted. I can understand not wanting to make the kids do anything too irredeemable, but it comes off weird to just have Ron and Hugo show back up and explain how it's Hugo's fault. I'm not a huge fan of this episode. And fun fact, this is the 200th episode overall. It's Thanksgiving now, and the Belcher whose love of food is behind only Bob's is sick in the bathroom. Gene can't keep any food down, and when he tries to eat anything, it ends up coming out of both sides. But that gives us the first time a vignette episode was layered over a holiday episode. And since Gene is the focal point of the stories this time around, they tag in Bob as the third storyteller. While I like the episode for the most part and the stories are, as always, super fun, it's really sad that it feels like we're robbed of a Thanksgiving episode this time. And that kind of makes it hard to judge this episode fairly because the Thanksgiving episodes have all been among the best of the best for the series. And Gene showing a rare violent side for a joke is hilarious. An alright episode. This episode revolves around the Belchers and Linda's parents at the airport while Linda's parents are dealing with a layover and the Belchers are trying to turn it into their yearly visit. And honestly, the best part of the episode is that Linda's parents are actually barely in it, because the more I've seen of them, the more I really can't stand their characters. And I know that's supposed to be the point, but even bad characters are still usually welcome additions to an episode. Look at Gale, for instance. I'd honestly rather have more episodes with Big Bob and see his character fleshed out a bit more. It's a pretty weak episode. So, Gene and Linda having a weirdly close connection is something that we've seen many, many times throughout the series, and for the most part, it's something that's been pretty easy to accept. A kid loves his mom. That's not really that weird of a thing for a character to have, especially in Bob's Burgers. But this episode takes that idea, dials it up to 11, and makes Gene absolutely unbearable. I've talked before about giving Gene more opportunities to not be the funny one-liner character. The episode tries to explore the idea of Linda as a person instead of Linda purely as a mother, but I think past episodes have done that better. Also, there's the line, "I like mom more than Linda." Holy hell, where did that come from? That's a brutal thing to say. I don't like this episode, definitely towards the bottom of the list. Bob's Burgers, the restaurant, has been selected as one of the caterers for a yacht club. They're not really sure why, but Bob assumes that Jimmy Pesto suggested them for the job so he could pants Bob in front of everyone. So Bob spends the entire episode dealing with that. Meanwhile, the kids are coming up with a plan to sneak on the boat that Teddy, who's playing Santa, is on with all of his presents for the kids. The Belcher kids obviously see the errors of their ways at the last minute, as we've seen about 200 times by now, and they learn a lesson. Though the best part of this episode is definitely the interactions between Bob and Jimmy Pesto. Jimmy actually admits to Bob that he suggested his restaurant because he wanted people to like the food. And after hearing Jimmy actually admit that, Bob does the unthinkable and helps Jimmy out. A good ending, but not a fantastic journey there. Mid-tier. So we're well over 200 episodes into the series by this point, so we're not exactly unfamiliar with the Belchers being on the cusp of greatness and everything spiraling out of control as their plans crash and burn. But what's kind of weird about this episode is that it seems like everything's about to fall apart, as we've seen many, many, many times before, and then it doesn't. The Belchers actually have one of the most successful nights we've ever seen, possibly ever. They turn their restaurant into a last-minute Valentine's date place, and the restaurant is packed the entire time. But Bob and Linda kind of put their own Valentine's plans on the back burner for the bulk of the episode. It was also kind of strange seeing Louise be super invested in the restaurant for once, though it was mostly just so she could make her own money. If she ever ends up taking over the restaurant at any point in the future, there's gonna be a Bob's Burgers in every city. The Tina subplot is pretty forgettable, and that really drags the episode down in my opinion. I'd say this one is somewhere around average. The Belchers being basically unable to properly take a Christmas photo is something I've never thought about, and makes all the sense in the world if you stop to think about it for even just a few moments. The episode mainly takes place on the mountain where the family takes their first ever successful Christmas photo. But Linda ends up with her hand stuck in some rocks, holding onto the camera so it doesn't fall and get destroyed. The bulk of the episode is mainly just them trying to figure out how to get Linda's arm out without dropping the camera. The episode itself isn't terribly funny aside from a few jokes here and there, Louise's serial killer face through the years gets me every time, as does how much Tina absolutely hates her brother's new harmonica. A below average episode. This episode feels like it's just there to try and close up something of a plot hole. Remember the wheelie mammoth that the kids won off the wharf a while back? Well, obviously it hasn't been seen since because the dang thing is just way too big. So Bob and Linda got rid of it when the kids stopped playing with it and told the kids they donated it to some orphans. A very obvious lie. Well, now the mammoth is showing back up. When the Belches are out, they come across the mammoth up for sale, so they do the responsible thing. They buy the mammoth, distract the kids, and rush the mammoth to a roller rink to keep the lie going. Obviously the lie comes out, but the mammoth does end up helping kids learn to skate. The episode doesn't really work for me. This feels like a weaker Gale showing, but I guess I'm glad they at least tried to explain the wheelie mammoth's disappearance. From the creators of Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks, why would you leave them alone? And Bob, Linda, these children are going to get into hijinks, why would you leave them home alone? Special No Tina edition. We're proud to present Bob, Linda, You Left Gene Home Alone, the only child who probably couldn't handle this. So Gene spends some of the episode just kind of going through everyone's stuff and doing things he couldn't do if other people were home, but he eventually gets trapped in the restaurant's basement and has to learn to be on his own for the first time. I guess I always thought that Gene would kind of enjoy being able to be home and playing music as loud as he wants, but to be fair, I guess he does that regardless. The episode feels like it lags for a good bit, and even when it gets going, it's not terribly strong, around average or so. Another week, another poop episode. This time, Linda has been dealing with a new diet and is out and about when the urge hits her. So when she's stuck between a rock and a hard place, well, we already know that Linda isn't a shy pooper. She just finds a spot and goes, and gets arrested. The rest of the episode revolves around Bob trying to get the money to pay for Linda's bail. But the banks are closed and his ATM card is scratched, and Linda doesn't want anyone to know what's going on. So of course the truth eventually comes out and Bob gets the money from Teddy. It's nice that for once it wasn't just a straight they don't have money issue and was an outside problem, but I think the story itself, for the most part, was pretty boring. Average episode. Tina isn't a fantastic student, so it's not exactly a huge surprise when we find out that she's failing Spanish. Tina is then required to go to the language lab in the library, which is just the back area with a couple of cassette tapes, where she almost immediately does the most Tina thing possible and falls in love with the voice of a 15-year-old boy. She spends more and more of her time listening to the tapes and actually learns a solid amount of Spanish in the process, which really shows me that it's not that Tina isn't smart, she just doesn't really know how to apply herself when it comes to school. As soon as she does, there's a pretty drastic transformation. So I guess that's kind of on Bob and Linda to a point. All they really have to do to get Tina invested in school is mention going to college and meeting college boys. She'd probably get a 4.0 at that rate. I think the episode works well for the most part. Louise and Jean training desperately to dunk Mr. Fra into the dunk tank, and Tina coming through in the end with what she's learned from the tapes brings the storylines together in a good way. Best of the season, I'd say. This makes 2 Tina-centric episodes in a row, but I like this one significantly less than the previous. Maybe that's just because I get weird Spy Kids flashbacks from the hands and clothes, or maybe it's just my general dislike of the plot of this episode. It's kinda hard to tell. Tina gets into hand dancing, which is probably supposed to be a parallel for drag shows if I really had to guess. But she has to balance doing stuff that's against rules and being a hall monitor. It's pretty boring. It's nice to hear that Helen and Teddy are dating, but I think that's probably the only positive I can think of in this episode. Aside from that one Millie scene.
No, this is a finger.
Millie!
This is one of those very rare episodes that I don't like. Bob is in a fender bender outside the restaurant, and the whole episode is just kind of about finding out who is to blame. But we know that Mort has a camera outside, so the whole situation could be solved super quickly. That aside, the episode is incredibly boring, and the scheming going on between the different pairings of people involved in the crash kind of makes me dislike just about every character in this episode, aside from Teddy, who is surprisingly the voice of reason in this episode. And they do a whole song about Bob's insurance premiums, but like a few episodes earlier, they were willing to dish out over $100 for the Wheelie Mammoth, so it's a weird change. Very weak episode. This episode features Louise on another one of her no-nonsense, get-the-job-done quests. But this time, it's for a slightly different reason. After Louise says something mean to Rudy, she spends the entirety of the episode carrying a model bridge rigged with very, very tiny explosives to Rudy's mom's house as a way to apologize to him. Seeing Louise say out loud to someone that she knows she's not good at apologizing is both a tremendous amount of growth and a super Louise thing to do. One thing I've really liked about the last few seasons is that they've gone out of their way to show a lot of growth from Louise. An average episode that I'd say is mostly below average, but is brought up by the emotional growth we see. This episode feels like a bundle of missed opportunities. The biggest being that I think this episode could have worked much better if they did the same plot but as more of a mystery. Like if all of the kids had possible motives, it would have been more interesting. But instead they just end up kind of trying to put the magazine into Dr. Yap's car. I don't know, it just doesn't feel like the strongest the episode could have been. The whole episode just doesn't really make sense to me. I'd put it towards the bottom of the list. Linda is getting into a spiff with Cynthia, Logan's mother, over a trash can that Linda's been decorating. Cynthia is convinced that the decorated trash cans will scare away business, which feels like something of a weird leap of logic. Dumb stuff like that tends to bring people in, not scare them away. Linda eventually takes the argument to city council and they end up siding with Linda. It's a relatively fun episode. The B-plot has Bob taking a weird interest in a cucumber growing in some guy's basement. It's the kind of fun, quirky B-plot that makes the show so fun. And I've seen many people get obsessed with stuff just as stupid. A pretty good episode overall. This episode feels a lot more coherent than many episodes the last few seasons have. Bob takes Tina to one of his favorite movies in a theater, a movie that's very obviously a Rocky Horror Picture Show reference. And while Bob is really excited to spend time with Tina and show her something he loves, Tina invites a bunch of her friends along to impress them. But, of course, a bunch of teens in a movie theater is probably the worst thing ever. But the scene towards the end of Tina leaning her head on Bob as they finish a really emotional heart-to-heart is honestly beautiful, and the kind of shot that makes the show so fantastic. And I'm really, really happy that's the last scene I get to talk about before going into the full rankings. I'm not going to be talking about Season 12 in this video because, as of the time I'm writing this, it's still ongoing. Maybe if this video does well, I'll talk about Season 12 and future seasons down the line and add them into the total rankings. Comment down below if you'd like to see that in the future. And just a heads up, where episodes landed on the list may have changed as I watched more of the series. An episode I may have said was mid-tier may have slid further down or gone up as more episodes were better or worse. Anyways, let's start from the bottom of the list and work towards the best. Local Shiro, Some Kind of Fender Benderful, Mutiny on the Windbreaker, Mommy Boy, Yurty Rotten Scoundrels, Brunch Squatch, Steel Magazinolias, The Terminator 2 Terminals of Endearment, Wag the Song, Dr. Yap, PTA It Ain't So, Lobster Fest, Lorenzo's Oil, no, Linda's, Tappity 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 Tap Tap Tap, Sacred Cow, Burger War, If You Love It So Much, Why Don't You Marionette, Fast Time Capsules at Wagstaff School, Boys Just Want to Have Fungus, Fingers Loose, Warforce, Bob Belcher and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Kids, Sexy Dance Fighting, Longtime Listener, First Time Bob, Bye Bye Boo Boo, Ambergris, Just One of the Boys for Now, Crawl Space, Roman Bobaday, Spaghetti Western and Meatballs, The Bleakening Part 1, There's No Business Like Mr. Business, Sacred Couch, I Bob Your Pardon, Food Truckin', Presto Tina-O, The Helen Hunt, What About Blob, An Inconvenient Truth, Dream a Little Bob of Bob, Fluise, The Gene Mile, Every Which Way But Goose, UF No You Didn't, Cheer Up Sleepy Jean, Weekend at Mort's, I Get Sight Chick Out of You, Live and Let Fly, Synchronized Swimming, Sliding Bobs, Impossible, Friends with Burger Fits, The Unbearable Likeness of Jean, Sleeping with a Frenemy, Die Card or Card Trying, Moody Food, As I Walk Through the Alley of the Shadow of Ramps, Torpedo, Heartbreak Hotel O'Ween, Hamburger Dinner Theater, The Hurt Soccer, Motor She Boat, The Bleakening Part 2, Lil Hard Dad, God Rest Ye Merry Gentle Mannequins, All That Jean, A Fish Called Tina, E2 Gaga Tambien, The Ring But Not Scary, The Belchies, Flat Top of the Morning to Ya, My Fuzzy Valentine, Human Flesh, The Kids Run the Restaurant, The Grandmama Pest Hotel, The Unnatural, A River Runs Through Bob, Nude Beach, Big Trouble in Little Tina, My Big Fat Greek Bob, Bed Bob and Beyond, Land of the Loft, Have Yourself a Maily Linda Christmas, Bob Fires the Kids, Like Jean for Chocolate, Now We're Not Cooking with Gas, Beef Squatch, Legends of the Mall, Seaplane, Yes Without My Zeke, Family Fracas, The Landship, Ex Machina, Better Off Sled, The Gene and Courtney Show, A Few Girt Men, The Horse Riderer, The Hawkening, Look Who's Hawking Now, Midday Run, The Handyman Can, She Shank Redemption, The Hormoniums, Worms of Enrearment, Aquaticism, Bob Day Afternoon, Speakeasy Rider, Mom Lies and Videotapes, Mr. Lonely Farts, Boy Watch, Bobby Driver, Easy Commercial, Easy Go-mercial, Yachty or Nice, Nicecapades, Roller, I Hardly Know Her, Bridge Over Troubled Rudy, The Deepening, See Me Now, Into the Mild, Zero LARP 30, Romancing the Beep, Three Girls and a Little Wharfie, Large Brother Where Fart Thou, Purple Rain Union, L'Independent Woman, Pro Tiki Con Tiki, Carpe Museum, The Wolf of Wharf Street, Diarrhea of a Poopy Kid, The Trouble with Doubles, The Silence of the Louise, Christmas in the Car, They Serve Horses, Don't They? Mo Mommy, Mo Problems, Nightmare on Ocean Avenue Street, 8 Miss Debatin', Copa Bobana, Slumber Party, Drum Forgiven, The Last Gingerbread House on the Left, The Secret Ceramics Room of Secrets, Mother-Daughter Laser Razor, Tina Witch, Mazel Tina, The Fran Fowls, V for Valentine Detta, Turkey in a Can, Prank You for Being a Friend, It Snakes a Village, Poops, I Did It Again, Uncle Teddy, Tell Me Dumb Thing Good, Go Tina on the Mountain, Just the Trip, World War II, The Wharfening, Fortnite, Sit Me Baby One More Time, Tweentrepreneurs, Full Bars, Gene It On, Two for Tina, Bed and Breakfast, Paraders of the Lost Float, E2 Tina Tombion, Something Old, Something New, Something Bob Caters for You, OT, The Outside Toilet, The Taking of Fun Time 123, Tina and the Real Ghost, The Millie Churian Candidate, The Kids Rob a Train, House Trap, Tina Taylor Soldier Spy, Vampire Disco Death Dance, Work Hard or Die Trying Girl, Can't Buy Me Math, Gail Making Bob Sled, Are You There Bob? It's Me, Birthday, Eggs for Days, Bob and Deliver, Father of the Bob, Boys for Now, The Gale Tales, The Lazarinth, The Quark Deucers, House of a Thousand Bounces, The Itty Bitty Ditty Committee, Adventures in Chinchilla Sitting, Secret Admirolerer, The Fresh Principal, The Cook, The Steve, The Gale and Her Lover, Late in the Afternoon in the Garden of Bob and Louise, Thanks Hoarding, An Indecent Thanksgiving Proposal, Sexy Dance Healing, Art Crawl, Wag the Hog, Earsy Rider, Dawn of the Peck, Bob Actually, Sheesh, Cab Bob, The Kids Run Away, Lice Things Are Lice, The Runway Club, Stand by Jean, Best Burger, The Haunting, Thelma and Louise except Thelma is Linda, Topsy, Tina Ranosaurus Rex, Hawk and Chick, Bad Tina, Eat, Spray, Linda, The Equestronauts, The Odor Games, Broadcast Wagstaff School News, Burgerboss, Glued, Where's My Bob?